Chapter 1. The Celestial Warning. The air atop the observatory of Valeth was sharp with the scent of the ocean, the distant crash of waves a reminder that Ulthuan floated, eternal and proud, upon the great ocean. Above, the stars shimmered like a sea of silver fire, their ancient paths traced across the heavens in an endless dance. Caladrius Starborn, astromancer of Lothern, stood alone within the high-vaulted tower, his sapphire robes billowing gently in the cool night breeze. His fingers moved with precision as he adjusted the vast crystal lenses of the celestial orrery, the enchanted device humming softly under his touch. Tonight, the heavens bore an omen. He leaned forward, golden eyes narrowing as he traced the alignment forming overhead. The constellations of Azurion's flame and Hoeth's judgment stood where they always had, but it was the slow, deliberate shift of the weeping moon that made his heart pound. That lone star, dark and sullen, had not moved in over 1,000 years. Yet now it bled its way across the night sky, drifting inexorably toward the sword of Cain, a cluster of stars that ancient texts claimed heralded war and ruin. Caladrius exhaled sharply, reaching for a quill and parchment. He had studied these omens for decades, searching for any pattern, any cycle to their return. But this was different. This was not the natural shifting of the cosmos, nor the misinterpretation of a lesser scholar. This was a warning, spoken in the language of the heavens themselves. He knew what the alignment meant, the song of the stars, a prophecy so ancient, so dire, that even the lore-master sages of Hoeth whispered of it with unease. It spoke of a time when the heavens themselves would turn against Ulthuan, when a great darkness would rise from the sea and consume the land. And now, after millennia of silence, the stars had begun to sing once more. If the prophecy was true, then Ulthuan was doomed. The Tower of the White Council, Lothern. The great council chamber was a place of wisdom and debate, where the most revered mages of Ulthuan gathered beneath vaulted runes that shimmered with arcane light. Caladrius stood before them now, his celestial maps and scrolls spread out upon a polished marble table. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, but the weight of skepticism was heavier still. At the head of the chamber sat Valor Sunwhisper, an elder mage of great renown, his piercing gaze fixed upon his former student. His golden robes shimmered with threads of moonlight, a symbol of his rank within the high lore-master's order. Around him, the other council members observed Caladrius in silence, their expressions unreadable. "You bring before us an old myth," Valor said finally, his voice measured. "A prophecy that has never come to pass." Caladrius shook his head. "Because the alignment has never been right until now. The weeping moon has moved after 1,000 years of stillness. It has drawn toward the sword of Cain. That has only happened once before, during the War of the Shadow King." Murmurs rippled through the chamber at the mention of that dark time, but Valor only sighed, tapping his fingers against the armrest of his chair. "The stars shift, Caladrius," he said. "You know this better than most. Even Hoeth himself would say that fate is a river, not a chain. You cannot expect us to declare doom upon all of Ulthuan based on—" "The heavens do not lie," Caladrius interrupted, his voice echoing through the chamber. "The song of the stars is written in light and shadow, and it has begun once more. If we do not act, if we do not prepare, then all will be lost." Aelthir, an aged lore-master with silvered hair, let out a weary sigh. "And what would you have us do, Caladrius? Prepare for war? Abandon our way of life because of an alignment?" Caladrius hesitated. He knew the council was not made up of fools. They were wise, cautious, but they had grown comfortable. The chaos invasions had been pushed back. The Druchi were always a threat, but the Phoenix King reigned unchallenged. Ulthuan had known peace for too long, And now, when true danger loomed, they refused to see it. "If we act now," he said, forcing himself to remain calm, "we may yet change fate. There is knowledge hidden in the lost archives of Hoeth, records of what was done last time the stars aligned this way. If I can study them—" Valar raised a hand, silencing him. "No." His voice carried the weight of finality. "You will not spread fear among our people over an omen. The White Tower will not waste time on superstition." Caladrius's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You are making a mistake." Valar regarded him sadly. Perhaps," he admitted. "Or perhaps it is you who has strayed too far into the void of prophecy." He sighed, glancing at the other council members. "Your studies have consumed you, Caladrius. Perhaps it is time you step away from the stars, lest you become lost in them." The Forsaken Scholar. Caladrius left the chamber with a storm raging inside him. The council had dismissed him, refused to believe the truth written in the stars. As he stepped onto the balcony of the great tower, he looked out over the vast expanse of Lothern, the shimmering canals, the radiant white towers, the golden beacon of the Phoenix throne in the distance. They were all blind. The stars did not lie. The song of the stars had begun again, and if no one would listen, he would find the answers himself. Turning sharply, he strode toward the spiral steps that led downward. If the White Tower would not grant him access to the lost archives, then he would find another way. The answers lay within the forbidden texts, within the prophecies buried deep beneath Hoeth's halls. The heavens had spoken, and Caladrius would not let Ulthuan fall without a fight. Chapter 2. The Vision of the End. The cold wind howled through the open balcony of Caladrius's chamber in the Tower of Lothern. His hands trembled over the ancient parchment spread before him, tracing the celestial symbols that foretold Ulthuan's doom. The council had refused to listen, dismissed his warnings as paranoia, but the heavens did not lie. He was alone in this. The flickering candlelight cast shadows against the marble walls, dancing eerily, as if the darkness itself was alive. Exhaustion clawed at his mind, but he could not rest, not while the stars still whispered of ruin. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, and reached out with his mind, beyond the walls of the tower, beyond the lands of Ulthuan, into the aether, where magic flowed like an unseen river. Then the world shattered. A vision of destruction. Caladrius gasped as he was ripped from his body, spiraling through the void, his soul cast adrift upon the winds of fate. His surroundings twisted, shifting from the dim glow of his study to an abyss of swirling mist and crimson fire. He stood now upon a ruined precipice, the air thick with a scent of blood and ash. Before him stretched Ulthuan, but not as he knew it. The spires of Lothern lay in ruins, their proud towers reduced to smoldering wrecks. The once glistening canals ran red with blood, and the mighty walls that had withstood countless sieges were now broken, shattered by some unfathomable force. Across the land, the great cities of the High Elves burned, their people reduced to fleeing wraiths amidst the chaos. The sky above was blackened, torn apart by an impossible vortex, a gaping wound in the heavens through which the void itself seeped. Lightning crackled through the churning storm, illuminating the silhouettes of terrible shapes, demonic forms writhing in delight, their monstrous laughter echoing through the abyss. Ulthuan was dying, and in the center of it all stood the figure, the whispering shadow. A being of pure darkness, clad in shifting shadows and adorned with symbols of ruin, loomed upon the remains of the Phoenix throne. Its form was neither mortal nor wholly demonic, shifting between a towering warrior wreathed in black fire and a serpentine entity with 100 watching eyes. It did not move, yet its presence crushed the air, an overwhelming force of power and malevolence. Then it spoke, but not with words. The voice slithered into Caladrius' mind like poisoned silk, pressing against his thoughts with an unbearable weight. "You see the truth, little seer." Caladrius stumbled back, his heart pounding. The words were not heard, they were felt, a presence in his soul, unraveling his very being. The stars do not lie. They sing the dirge of a world already lost. The song has begun, and nothing can silence it. Caladrius gritted his teeth, summoning what willpower he had. "Who are you?" he demanded, though his voice was weak against the presence before him. The figure laughed, a terrible, resonant sound that sent ripples through the very fabric of the vision. "I am the truth the elves refuse to see. I am the echo of fate and the shadow of what will come." A gust of wind howled through the ruins, and suddenly Caladrius saw figures standing among the destruction. His kin, their once proud armor twisted and broken, their eyes filled with despair. Among them he saw familiar faces. Mages, warriors, lords of Ulthuan, all kneeling before the shadowed figure. They will all kneel in the end. The entity stepped forward, extending a hand wreathed in black fire. "You are clever, little seer. You know the White Tower will not act. They will let fate claim Ulthuan. But you have seen the truth." A burning pain seared into Caladrius' forehead, and for a brief moment he glimpsed something deeper, something older than the prophecy itself. A second verse, hidden from the texts, a name unspoken for millennia. "Seek the Starheart. The answer lies in the past." Then the darkness collapsed inward, and the world was ripped away. Awakening to purpose. Caladrius jolted upright with a gasp, his breath ragged, his body slick with cold sweat. The candle in his study had burned down to a mere ember, and the scent of scorched parchment filled the air. His hands trembled as he clutched the table, his mind still reeling from what he had seen. A vision, a prophecy, a warning. He pressed a shaking hand against his forehead. It burned, not physically, but as though something had been marked upon his soul. He had not merely witnessed the prophecy, he had felt it. And the name, Starheart. The council had refused to listen. The White Tower had chosen willful blindness, but the heavens had shown him the truth. Ulthuan would fall unless he acted. The answer was out there, buried in history, hidden from the archives of Hoeth. If no one else would seek it, then he would do it alone. Caladrius stood, his resolve solidifying like tempered steel. He reached for his cloak, fastening it around his shoulders. His mind was set. He would defy the White Tower, he would seek out the lost prophecy, and he would uncover the truth of the Song of the Stars before it was too late. Chapter 3. The Council's Indifference. The halls of the Tower of Hoeth stood timeless and serene, their alabaster spires reaching toward the heavens, as if they themselves sought wisdom from the stars. The great libraries of Sapphire, filled with the accumulated knowledge of countless generations, stood in silent defiance of time itself. Within their depths, the most learned of Ulthuan's sages debated the intricacies of magic, philosophy, and fate. And tonight they would dismiss the truth. The gathering of the sages. Caladrius's boots echoed against the polished marble as he strode into the council of sages, his heart pounding despite his best efforts to still it. The chamber was vast, lined with enchanted tapestries that shimmered with images of Ulthuan's past glories. Around the great circular table sat the most revered minds of Sapphire, archmages, lore masters, and seers, their long robes adorned with golden runes that flickered in the candlelight. At the head of the table sat Archmage Valor Sunwhisper, his once-kin eyes now veiled in weariness. His silver-gold hair, bound in the style of the ancient scholars, framed a face that had not yet bent to age, but Caladrius saw the weight of centuries behind his gaze. Once, Valor had been his mentor, his guiding star in the study of the heavens. But now, that bond felt distant, fragile. Caladrius spread his celestial charts before them, his fingers tracing the patterns he had spent weeks unraveling. "The stars do not lie," he began, voice steady despite the growing weight in his chest. "The weeping moon has begun its alignment with the sword of Cain, a conjunction unseen since the War of the Shadow King. The song of the stars has begun anew." Silence greeted him. Then a soft chuckle broke it. Lord Master Aelthir, an elder scholar whose beard was as white as the mist over the inner sea, folded his hands before him. "The song of the stars," he mused, shaking his head. "A myth, young Starborn, a tale told to frighten initiates." Another mage, Selanar of Yvresse, leaned back in his chair. "Indeed, you would have us believe that Ulthuan stands upon the precipice of doom because of a mere alignment? It is not mere coincidence," Caladrius pressed, his frustration bleeding into his words. "I have studied these patterns for decades, and 2 nights ago I saw a vision." A murmur of amusement spread through the sages. Valor raised a single hand, silencing them. His golden eyes locked onto Caladrius with quiet scrutiny. "A vision," he repeated. Caladrius hesitated. He knew how this sounded. But he had seen it, the broken spires, the wailing dead, the sky torn asunder by a force that did not yet have a name. He could still hear the whispers of that shadowed entity, the weight of its presence, still lingering upon his soul. "I saw Ulthuan burning," he said. "I saw the heavens torn apart. I saw a being of darkness upon the Phoenix throne. And it spoke to me. It knew of the prophecy. It named the Starheart as the key to our salvation." Silence. Then Valor sighed. It was not an exasperated sound, nor one of anger, just quiet disappointment. "You are a fine scholar, Caladrius," he said, "but you have wandered too far into the realm of prophecy. Do you not recall what happened to those before you who did the same?" A cold chill settled in Caladrius' gut. "This is different," he insisted. "The song of the stars is a myth." Valor's voice was gentle but firm. "The heavens are vast and ever-changing. If we saw doom in every shift of the constellations, we would never know peace. Visions, prophecies, they are dangerous things, Caladrius. They lead even the greatest minds into madness." Caladrius felt heat rising in his chest. "You refuse to see what is right before you." "No," Valor said. "I refuse to let a student of mine fall into the same obsession that claimed so many others before you." The murmurs around the table grew louder. Aelthir shook his head. "I fear you have spent too long staring into the void, young Starborn." Selanar smirked. "Perhaps he has been listening to too many stories from the Shadowlands. The Druchii are always whispering of doom, after all." Caladrius's hands curled into fists. "So you would do nothing?" Valor met his gaze. "We will do nothing, because there is nothing to be done." He exhaled, then added with finality, "You will not spread fear among our people. This matter is closed." The scholar's defiance. Caladrius stormed from the chamber, his mind a whirlwind of rage and disbelief. The greatest minds of Ulthuan, the guardians of its knowledge, had dismissed him. They had chosen blindness over truth, comfort over action. His pulse thundered as he reached the outer balcony, the ocean wind whipping at his robes. Below, the silver-lit city of Lothern stretched to the horizon, its spires aglow in the moonlight. He had always thought Ulthuan eternal, unshakable, but now he knew better. The council had turned their backs on him, but that did not mean he would turn his back on the truth. If they would not seek the Starheart, then he would. If they would not act, then he must. Caladrius looked up, toward the heavens that had whispered their warning. The stars sang, even now, and he would not let their song be ignored. Chapter 4. A Hidden War. The ruling elite of Ulthuan, in their shining spires and hallowed halls, believed their land to be eternal. They placed their faith in the Phoenix throne, in the White Tower, in the vigilance of their armies and scholars. But they did not see the rot creeping beneath the marble and silver. They did not see the war already begun in the shadows. The sorceress of the western reaches. Far beyond the sight of the Phoenix King's court, beyond the white cliffs of Ulthuan's western shores, the winds of dark magic howled. In the dead of night, a fleet of black-sailed ships loomed upon the horizon. The waters churned unnaturally beneath them, an eerie mist rolling in their wake. The Druki had come again, not in full invasion, but in silence, slipping through the cracks of Ulthuan's vigilance, like the whisper of a blade before the kill. At the prow of the lead vessel stood Luthiel Nightbane, her violet robes billowing like smoke, her lips moving in a silent incantation. The air around her crackled with power, the taste of sorcery thick upon the wind. Her pale eyes, devoid of mercy, were fixed upon the distant cliffs. Ulthuan would never suspect what was coming. The ships made landfall upon the shrouded coast, an isolated and forbidden stretch of Ulthuan's western shores. No settlement stood here, only ruins, ancient and crumbling, remnants of a time when the elven gods still walked among mortals. Here, beneath the shattered spires of an Elvenar temple, the Druki sorceress and her disciples prepared their ritual. Black-clad warriors formed a circle of blood, their hands slick with the lifeblood of captive Asur, high elves stolen from Lothern's very streets. Their muffled cries were lost in the howling wind as Luthiel raised her hands, her staff glowing with unnatural light. "In the name of Cain," she whispered, "let the veil thin." The ground trembled, the very air shuddered as an ancient power stirred beneath the ruined temple. Something was waking. The cult of the bleeding moon. While Luthiel's Druki eyes schemed on the distant coast, another darkness festered within Ulthuan itself, one the Phoenix King's court had yet to even notice. Beneath the gilded avenues of Lothern, in the cavernous depths of the underhalls, flickering torches cast red light against stone walls. Hooded figures knelt before an altar of bone, their heads bowed in reverence. The air was thick with the scent of blood, incense, and the metallic tang of dark sorcery. The cult of the bleeding moon had grown in secret, its tendrils spreading through Ulthuan like a cancer. Among them stood high-born nobles, their lips stained with the blood of their own kin. Warriors of Ulthuan's armies, disillusioned and hungry for power, whispered oaths to unseen gods. Even some mages of Sapphire, blinded by their pursuit of forbidden knowledge, had joined the cult's ranks, their robes now marked with the sigil of the bleeding moon, a crimson eclipse, signifying the fall of the Phoenix throne. At the head of the altar, a figure clad in black and red raised a chalice of blood toward the shadows beyond the flames. His voice, deep and hypnotic, echoed against the cavern walls. "The stars have aligned," he proclaimed. "The song has begun." Murmurs of reverence filled the chamber. "Ulthuan's rulers have grown weak," the figure continued. "They have forgotten the true gods, the ones who demand sacrifice. But we remember, and when the moon bleeds, when the sky is torn asunder, we shall rise from the ashes of this broken kingdom." A chorus of voices rose in unison, chanting words lost to time, words that had not been spoken since the War of the Shadow King. Deep within the chamber, unseen by mortal eyes, something stirred in the darkness, watching. The stars sang their prophecy, but only those who walked the path of blood could hear their full verse. A kingdom blind to its fate. As the mages of the White Tower dismissed prophecy, as the Phoenix King's court sat secure in their illusions of peace, the war had already begun. In the west, a sorceress whispered secrets to the void. Beneath Lothern, A cult gathered in the dark, its reach growing with each passing night. And above them all, the stars watched, their silent song unchanging. For Ulthuan's doom was not coming. It was already here. Chapter 5. The Forbidden Archives. The Tower of Hoeth loomed in the distance, its ivory spires gleaming beneath the silver light of the moon. It was a place of wisdom, of power, where the greatest minds of the High Elves had spent millennia unearthing the mysteries of magic and fate. But even here, among the vast libraries and sacred halls, there were truths that had been buried. And tonight, Caladrius Starborn would unearth them. A scholar in defiance. The grand libraries of the White Tower stretched high into the darkness, their towering shelves packed with scrolls, tomes, and grimoires older than many of Ulthuan's greatest cities. In these halls, the past was preserved, and yet there were places within even these libraries where no scholar was permitted to tread. The Forbidden Archives lay in the lowest reaches of the tower, behind wards of secrecy, hidden from all but the archmages themselves. Here the knowledge deemed too dangerous, too blasphemous, or too terrifying to be freely read was kept sealed away. Caladrius knew he had only one chance. His presence in the tower was not sanctioned. He had already been warned by the sages of Sapphire to abandon his studies of the Song of the Stars, to turn away from prophecy and omens. But he could not, he would not. Ulthuan's doom was real, and if the council refused to act, then he must. Silently he moved through the empty corridors, his robes whispering against the stone. The air was thick with enchantments, wards that hummed faintly, unseen eyes that watched for intruders. But he was no novice. A whispered incantation, a subtle flick of his fingers, and the detection spells flickered away. With careful precision he reached the gate of the Forbidden Archives, a massive door of silver, marked with the sigils of the lore masters of old. It was locked by magic older than most elves still living, bound by the will of those who had deemed this knowledge too dangerous to be known. But Caladrius had come prepared. Pulling a small crystal vial from his robes, he traced a rune into the door's surface, then poured a drop of enchanted starlight essence onto the sigil. The metal trembled, and the ancient wards shuddered, as if resisting his intrusion. Then, with a low groan, the door swung open. The Lament of Eldenor. The chamber beyond was unlike any other in the White Tower. Dust lay thick upon forgotten tomes, their bindings cracked with age. The scent of old parchment and ancient ink filled the air. These books, these scrolls, they were not merely records, they were warnings. Moving swiftly, Caladrius searched the shelves, his fingers trailing over the spines of ancient texts. The fall of Belshazzar, the wars of the Shadow King, the prophecies of Anirion. So many disasters, so much death, recorded in these pages, histories the White Tower had chosen to forget. And then he found it. A tattered volume, its title barely visible beneath the dust. The Lament of Eldenor. His breath caught. Eldenor had once been a proud elven kingdom, a land spoken of only in myths. It had thrived in the early days of the world, before the Sundering, before the rise of the Druchii. Yet no ruins remained, no artifacts, only whispers in forgotten texts. With careful hands he opened the tome. The pages were worn, brittle, yet the words burned into them seared his mind with their clarity. It spoke of a time when the stars had shifted, when the heavens had sung a song of doom. The rulers of Eldenor had dismissed the warnings, calling them superstition, until it was too late. A great darkness had risen from the depths of the sea, swallowing the land whole. And then, the passage that made his heart stop. Only the Isle of Ithmar held the key to their salvation, but by the time the truth was known, it had already been lost beneath the waves. The Isle of Ithmar. Caladrius traced the words again, as if willing them to change, to confirm what he already feared. The Song of the Stars had come before. It had already destroyed an entire civilization. And now it had returned. The sunken truth. He turned the pages frantically, searching for more. Ithmar, an ancient island once home to the greatest smiths of the elven race, where metal as light as a feather yet stronger than dragon scale had been forged. Its ruins now lay beneath the sea, swallowed by time and magic alike, and yet the book suggested something remained. In the deep, where the silver halls of Ithmar still lie, the last light of the heavens may yet be found. A weapon, a relic, some ancient knowledge that could turn the tide of fate. Whatever it was, the elves of Eldenor had failed to claim it in time, and they had perished for it. He would not make the same mistake. Closing the tome, he clutched it to his chest, his mind racing. If the key to stopping Ulthuan's doom lay in Ithmar, then he had to find it. But first, he had to escape, for as he turned, stepping back toward the exit, he felt it. A presence, not physical, not seen, but something watching, something that had been awoken the moment he had touched the forbidden knowledge. A whisper curled through the darkness, low and serpentine. "You have found the path, little seer." The chamber darkened, the shadows pulling together into something almost solid. The air grew thick, suffocating, as a single crimson eye opened in the void, gazing at him with amusement. "Run." Caladrius did not hesitate. Clutching the book, he fled, the shadows snapping at his heels. Magic flared as he raced through the corridors, the wards of the White Tower blazing to life in response to the disturbance. Voices rang out, mages stirring, alarms being raised. But he did not stop. He had what he needed. Ulthuan's past had already sung the first verse of its doom. If he did not act, history would sing the second. Chapter 6. The Inquisitor's Hunt. The stars still burned above, but now they felt like eyes, watching, waiting. Caladrius ran. The forbidden archives lay behind him, but the weight of the knowledge he carried felt heavier than any spellbook. He clutched the Lament of Eldenor to his chest, his mind still reeling from what he had discovered. The Isle of Ithmar, the key to stopping Ulthuan's doom, was lost beneath the sea, waiting to be found. But first, he had to survive. The hunters in the tower. The moment he stepped into the upper halls, the White Tower came alive. Silver runes blazed to life along the corridors, the very walls humming with arcane energy. He had triggered the wards. And now they were coming for him. A distant voice rang out, cold and commanding. "Caladrius Starborn, you have trespassed where no scholar may walk. Surrender now, and you will be spared." The mage inquisitors, the enforcers of the White Tower. They answered only to the archmages, wielding magic not to study, but to punish. If they captured him, they would not merely take the book. They would wipe his mind of what he had seen, erase the knowledge as if he had never found it. That could not happen. Whispering a spell under his breath, Caladrius flicked his wrist, sending a pulse of light through the corridor. The floating lanterns burst, plunging the hall into darkness. Shadows flickered around him as he turned the corner, slipping through a hidden passage, one of many he had learned during his studies. A sudden blast of arcane force tore past him, shattering the stone wall beside him. "Run all you like, scholar," came a voice from behind. "The stars will not hide you." Caladrius gritted his teeth and ran harder. A friend in exile. He reached the outer courtyard of the White Tower just as a sleek elven skyship hovered above the landing docks, its blue sails emblazoned with a silver spear. A lone figure stood at the helm, a tall warrior clad in ocean-weathered armor, his long golden hair tied in a loose knot. his piercing eyes scanning the courtyard below. Thalion Brightspear, a disgraced captain, a soldier who had once fought for Ulthuan before he was cast out for defying orders, and the only man who would help him now. "Caladrius, you damned fool," Thalion called down, amusement laced with urgency. "You couldn't have stolen a less dangerous book." Caladrius skidded to a halt, panting. "We need to leave, now!" The air crackled behind him as the mage inquisitors stepped into the open courtyard. 3 figures, their robes marked with the sigil of Hoeth's judgment, their hands already burning with white-hot magic. One of them, a stern-faced woman with runes carved into her skin, stepped forward. "You cannot run from the White Tower, Caladrius," she said. "Surrender, and you will not be harmed." Caladrius barely had time to react before the inquisitors raised their hands. The air shattered. A wave of pure magical force crashed toward him. Caladrius threw up a warding sigil, but the impact hurled him backward, sending him sprawling. The book flew from his grasp, tumbling toward the edge of the dock. A blur of motion, Thalion leaped down, snatching the tome out of the air before it could fall. With a swift motion, he reached down and hauled Caladrius to his feet. "I take it you're not surrendering," the warrior muttered. "Not today." Thalion grinned. "Good. I hate sailing alone." With a powerful kick, he launched them both onto the deck of the skyship. Go. The ship's pilot, a hooded figure with an enchanted eye, slammed a crystal sphere into the control runes. The sails flared with light, and the ship lurched forward, soaring away from the tower. Behind them, the inquisitors unleashed bolts of lightning, but they struck empty air. Caladrius let out a slow breath, gripping the railing as the ship sped into the night. They had escaped. For now. The storm at sea. 2 nights later, the ship cut through the waters of the Western Ocean, its sails full and its crew silent. The destination lay ahead, the Isle of Ithmar, lost beneath the sea. Caladrius stood at the bow, the Lament of Eldenor open in his hands. He had studied the text a dozen times now, tracing every clue, every passage. Ithmar's last known location had been west of Kothic, before it was swallowed by the ocean in some ancient calamity. If it still existed, it was beneath the waves, and that meant they would need to find a way down. Thalion approached, arms crossed. "You're sure about this?" Caladrius nodded. "If the book is right, Ithilmar's ruins hold something that can stop the prophecy?" Thalion sighed. "And if the book is wrong? Then we sail into the depths for nothing." The captain shook his head. "Not the worst thing I've done." Before Caladrius could respond, the wind shifted. The sky, once clear, now churned with black clouds. A thick mist rose from the ocean, twisting unnaturally, curling around the ship like grasping hands. The air grew heavy, charged with magic, but not the magic of Ulthuan. Something else. Something wrong. A voice whispered through the fog. "You should not have come, Seer." Lightning crashed, illuminating dark shapes in the mist. Unnatural shadows, figures moving just beyond sight. Then the sea exploded. A wave of impossible size rose before them, engulfing the sky, the stars, the world. Caladrius barely had time to breathe a spell before the ocean swallowed them whole. Into the depths. The last thing he saw before the blackness took him was Thalion reaching for him, his voice lost beneath the roaring wind. Then, silence. The ship vanished beneath the waves, and the prophecy's song continued. Chapter 7. Shadows on the Wind. The sky above the shrouded coast was thick with storm clouds, the air heavy with the scent of rain and sea brine. The waves crashed against jagged black rocks, their echoes swallowed by the darkness that clung to the land. Far from the gaze of the Phoenix throne, upon a secluded cliffside shrouded in mist, a council of shadows gathered, the gathering of spies. Luthiel Nightbane stood at the heart of a ruined Elvanar temple, her violet robes fluttering in the unnatural wind that whispered through the broken pillars. Around her, Druchii warriors knelt in silence, lethal figures clad in midnight black armor, their faces hidden behind razor-edged helms. The Council of Spies had arrived. 6 figures stepped forward from the darkness, their forms wrapped in shadow cloaks that shimmered with enchantments designed to hide them from scrying eyes. Each bore the sigil of Nagaron's intelligence network, the feared hand of Malekith, agents who moved unseen even among their own kind, carrying secrets that could shatter kingdoms. Luthiel regarded them with cold amusement. "You have come a long way," she said, her voice like silk laced with venom. "I assume you have news worth hearing?" The tallest of the spies, a gaunt figure with cruel, angular features, stepped forward. His name was Vaedrith, a master of secrets who had long served the Witch King's unseen network. His golden eyes gleamed beneath the hood of his shadow cloak. "The White Tower stirs," Vaedrith said, his voice smooth but edged with malice. "The astromancer, Caladrius Starborn, has stolen something from the Forbidden Archives. A text, the Lament of Eldanor." Luthiel's expression remained unreadable, but her fingers tightened around her staff. "The fool chases ghosts," she mused, "and yet you would not have come if that was all there was to say." Vaedrith's lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. "His searches for the Isle of Ithmar." At that, the gathered Druchii warriors shifted, some whispering curses under their breath. Luthiel's pulse quickened, though she did not let it show. The Isle of Ithmar. A name spoken only in myth, a ruin lost to the depths of time. If the ancient records were to be believed, it had once been a jewel of the High Elves, home to the greatest forges of Eldanar's age, before it was swallowed by the sea. And if Caladrius was searching for it, then he was close to something far greater than even he understood. Luthiel turned her gaze back to Vaedrith. "How do you know this?" "The stars sing to more than just the Asur," Vaedrith replied smoothly. "We have long had spies in the White Tower. The mage inquisitors hunted him, but he escaped. He sails west even now." Luthiel let the words settle. The mage inquisitors were not subtle hunters. They acted only when something truly dangerous was at stake. If they had been sent after Caladrius, then the knowledge he carried was not merely forbidden, it was feared, and that made it valuable. Luthiel turned toward the dark sea beyond the cliffs. The western waters, the grave of Ithmar. She knew these waters well. She had seen things in their depths, things that whispered in the currents, things that still hungered. A race against fate. The sea wind howled as Luthiel stepped toward the edge of the ruins, her eyes narrowing toward the horizon. She had no doubt that Caladrius believed he was chasing a means to save Ulthuan. But he was wrong. The Lament of Eldanor did not speak of salvation. It spoke of a power lost beneath the waves, one that had been hidden for good reason. And now, like a blind fool, the astromancer sought to bring it back into the world. She would not allow it. Luthiel turned back to the spies. "How many ships does he have?" Vaedrith said with a smirk. "A single Ashur vessel, barely fit for war. It will not survive the western waters." Luthiel's expression darkened. "Then we must ensure it does not reach Ithmar." She turned toward the waiting Druchii fleet, anchored beyond the cliffs, sleek black vessels, their sails marked with the sigil of House Nightbane. "Send word to the captains," she commanded. "We set sail at once. No Azur must reach that island before us. If they do—" She glanced toward the sea, where something stirred beneath the waves, something vast and waiting. Then they will wake what was meant to stay buried. The storm overhead deepened, dark clouds thickening as if the heavens themselves sensed what was coming. The race had begun, and fate was already shifting in the wind. Chapter 8. The Isle of Ithmar. The sea was unnaturally still. After the storm that had nearly swallowed them whole, the waters of the Western Ocean had become eerily calm, their surface like black glass beneath the pale light of the moon. The wreckage of their battle with the storm had been cast aside, the ship's masts splintered, sails torn, but against all odds, they had survived. And now, as the mist began to part, the Isle of Ithmar rose from the depths before them. The drowned ruins. What remained of the island was little more than a cluster of cragged peaks jutting from the water, the last remnants of a land that had once been one of Ulthuan's greatest strongholds. White marble towers, long collapsed, lay half-submerged in the depths, their spires now home only to the sea's embrace. Ancient causeways, broken by time and tides, led to what had once been a grand citadel, its entrance marked by columns of silver-veined stone, still gleaming faintly despite their ruin. Thalion Brightspear, still nursing a wound from the storm, stood at the prow of their battered vessel, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight. "We came all this way for that?" Caladrius ignored him. Magic still clung to these stones, the air thrumming with an energy long forgotten. He could feel it. This was no mere ruin. It was a place where the stars had once spoken. As their small skiff scraped against the stone landing, he stepped onto the ancient walkway, running his fingers across the smooth carvings. The glyphs were elven, but not the High Elven script he knew. This was older, untouched since before the Sundering. "The Lament of Eldanor spoke of a great vault," he murmured, more to himself than to Thalion. "A place where the last remnants of their knowledge were sealed before the sea swallowed them." Thalion adjusted his grip on his spear, his sharp gaze scanning the shadows of the ruins. "Then let's find it quickly. These stones might be dead, but I'd wager we're not the first fools to come looking." They pressed forward, weaving through collapsed corridors and flooded halls, the moonlight filtering through the broken ceiling in pale, fractured beams. The deeper they went, the stronger the pulse of magic became, leading them toward a single chamber, its doors still intact, sealed with glyphs of starlight and silver. Caladrius raised a trembling hand. "This is it. The Moonstone Codex." With a whisper of power, the ancient seals unraveled, and the doors slowly groaned open, revealing a vault untouched by time. The air inside was cool and dry, preserved by the magic that had lingered here for millennia. And at the chamber's center, resting upon a pedestal of polished moonstone, was a single codex. Its pages were thin as silk, bound in an unknown material that shimmered like captured moonlight. Runes, some familiar, some alien, glowed faintly upon its surface. The moment Caladrius touched it, a surge of knowledge rippled through him. The Song of the Stars was not new. It had been sung before, written into the heavens, long before the fall of Eldanor. The Codex spoke of a force beyond prophecy, a power that did not merely predict fate, but had the ability to change it. The Starheart. The name burned in his mind like a brand, its meaning half forgotten in the sands of time. "The Starheart?" Thalion asked, his voice quiet. Caladrius barely breathed. "A relic of the heavens, lost when Ithmar fell. If the prophecy is true, then it holds the power to rewrite fate itself." A moment of silence stretched between them. Then, a distant sound, the whisper of steel against leather, the rustle of movement among the ruins. Caladrius froze. He turned to Thalion, whose expression had darkened into a warrior's grim certainty. "We're not alone. The Druchii strike." From the shadows, figures emerged, clad in midnight armor, their faces concealed behind serpentine masks. Druchii, the shadow blades of Naggarond. And at their center, stepping forward with the grace of a hunting panther, was Luthiel Nightbane. Her violet robes, edged in silver filigree, fluttered as she walked, her cold emerald eyes locking onto the moonstone codex in Caladrius's hands. The air around her shimmered with dark sorcery, a faint smirk playing across her lips. "So the little seer found what he was looking for," she purred, tilting her head. "I almost pity you." Thalion shifted beside Caladrius, his spear spinning into a ready stance. "Get in line." Luthio laughed softly, shaking her head. "You truly do not understand what you hold, do you?" Her gaze flicked to Caladrius, unreadable. The Starheart was buried for a reason. The Aesir think they can shape their own fate, that they can outmaneuver the heavens, but fate is a blade, and it does not favor fools. Caladrius tightened his grip on the codex. "You wouldn't be here if you thought this knowledge was meaningless." The amusement in Luthio's eyes vanished. "No, I wouldn't." With a flick of her wrist, the Druki warriors moved, silent as the wind, their blades flashing in the moonlight. Thalion lunged forward, his spear catching the first assassin's blade, twisting and breaking the strike before driving the haft into the warrior's throat. The Druchi crumpled, but two more took his place, their twin daggers weaving like striking vipers. Caladrius whispered an incantation, his fingers tracing a rapid glyph in the air. A pulse of starlight energy blasted outward, hurling one of the Druki back, his body smashing against the ruined wall. But before Caladrius could react, Luthio was upon him. Her fingers crackled with black lightning as she struck, her magic ripping through his defenses like silk. Pain exploded through his body as he was flung back, slamming into the stone pillar behind him. Stars burst across his vision, and the codex nearly slipped from his grasp. "Too slow," Luthio murmured, stepping forward. "Your kind has spent too long dreaming of stars, but you have forgotten what it means to bleed." She raised her hand for the killing blow. But Thalion was faster. With a roar, he drove his spear into her side, the blade biting deep. Luthio hissed in pain, staggering back, black fire searing around her wound. She raised her free hand, snapping an incantation that sent waves of shadow rolling outward, forcing Thalion and Caladrius back. But she did not press the attack. Instead, she smiled, her eyes glinting in the darkness. "This is far from over, seer." And with a single whispered word, the Druki melted into the shadows, disappearing as suddenly as they had come. The ruins fell silent once more. Caladrius, chest heaving, pushed himself to his feet. The codex was still in his hands. Thalion wiped blood from his blade, grimacing. "That went well." Caladrius exhaled, looking toward the starless sky. The Druki had failed to take the book, but they would be back. And now there was no turning back. They had the truth. Now they needed to find the Starheart before their enemies did. Chapter 9. The Duel in the Ruins. The ruins of Ithmar were no longer silent. Moonlight flickered off shattered columns and broken marble, painting the crumbling remains of the ancient city in silver and shadow. The Druki had returned, their dark shapes moving like ghosts through the mist, their blades hungry for blood. And standing before them was a single warrior, his spear poised in a battle stance, his golden eyes locked onto his foe. Thalion Brightspear. Before him stood a Druki champion, his armor as dark as the abyss, his twin blades gleaming with a sickly green glow. His name was Vaedrith the Severed, one of Nagaran's deadliest duelists, and his eyes held nothing but murderous glee. The two warriors met in the ruins, and the duel began. Steel against steel. Vaedrith struck first, his twin swords flashing in the dim light. His movements were impossibly fast, the curved blades whistling through the air like the whisper of death itself. Thalion barely dodged the first strike, twisting to the side as one blade sliced through the air where his throat had been a heartbeat before. The second strike came immediately, and he barely had time to raise his spear to block it. The impact shuddered through his arms, forcing him back a step. "Too slow, Ashur," Vaedrith sneered. Thalion smirked. I was just getting warmed up." With a sudden burst of speed, Thalion lunged forward, his spear darting for a killing thrust. Vaydrith sidestepped effortlessly, spinning like a shadow and lashing out with his heel. The kick slammed into Thalion's ribs, sending him skidding backward across the stone. But he did not fall. Instead, he let the momentum carry him into a reverse strike, sweeping his spear low to take Vaydrith's legs out from under him. The Druchii barely managed to leap over the attack, flipping mid-air, his blades flashing downward as he landed. Thalion raised his spear just in time, catching both swords against the shaft of his weapon. Sparks flew as the two warriors locked together, muscles straining, faces inches apart. "You fight well," Vaydrith admitted, a grin spreading across his scarred lips. "It will be a shame to cut you open." Thalion bared his teeth. "Try it, you knife-eared bastard." With a roar, he shoved the Druchii backward, launching into a flurry of attacks. His spear became a blur, spinning and striking with blinding speed, forcing Vaydrith onto the defensive. The ruins rang with the clash of steel, sorcery and shadow. While the warriors clashed, Caladrius faced a battle of his own. A pulse of dark magic exploded toward him, and he barely had time to raise a defensive ward before it struck. The impact sent him staggering backward, his robes singed, the air around him crackling with raw power. Luthiel Nightbane advanced, her emerald eyes glowing with malice, her hands wreathed in tendrils of black lightning. "You should have stayed in your tower, seer," she purred, stepping forward. "You do not belong in the world of warriors." Caladrius wiped blood from his lips. "And yet, here I stand." Luthiel smiled. "Not for much longer." She thrust her hand forward, and a wave of shadow flame surged toward him. Caladrius countered with a blast of starlight, the two spells colliding mid-air in a violent eruption of force. The sheer impact shattered nearby stone pillars, sending debris raining down. But Caladrius did not stop. He whispered an incantation, tracing a sigil in the air. The winds of Azir howled to his command, and a storm of pure arcane energy spiraled into existence. Lightning cracked overhead, lashing out toward Luthiel. She barely managed to throw up a shield, but the force of the spell drove her back, her robes billowing from the impact. Her eyes flashed with fury. "Very well," she hissed, gathering power between her palms. "Let's see what the stars whisper when you burn." The ground beneath Caladrius split open, raw darkness pouring forth as she unleashed her full might. Escape through fire. The battle raged, but time was running out. Thalion dodged another strike, his muscles burning with exhaustion. Vaydrith had not tired. If anything, he fought with renewed vigor, his laughter echoing through the ruins. But Thalion knew something the Druchii didn't. The duel had carried them closer to the edge of the ruins, right where Caladrius needed them to be. With a final, desperate move, Thalion twisted his spear, locking Vaydrith's swords in place for just an instant. "Enjoy the swim," he muttered. Then he drove his boot into the Druchii's chest, sending him hurtling backward over the ledge. Vaydrith vanished into the mist below, cursing as he plunged into the sea. "Let's go!" Thalion shouted. Caladrius heard him, but his battle was still raging. Luthiel was closing in, her magic twisting around her like serpents of shadow. He had one chance. Gathering the last of his strength, he threw the Moonstone Codex into Thalion's hands. "Run." Then he turned back to Luthiel, whispering one final spell. The ruins shook as a massive blast of arcane energy exploded between them, shattering columns, sending stone and debris raining down. The force sent both combatants flying. The cost of escape. Thalion dragged Caladrius from the rubble, his grip tight as they stumbled back toward the ruined docks. Their ship was still waiting, battered, barely seaworthy, but it would have to do. But fate had one more cruelty to offer. As they reached the vessel, the sea churned violently. A final bolt of sorcery, Luthiel's rage given form, struck the ship's hull. Wood splintered. The masts snapped like twigs. The entire vessel shuddered, and then, with a groaning wail, it began to sink. Caladrius watched in horror. Their only escape was gone. Thalion let out a bitter laugh. You just had to steal the most cursed book in existence, didn't you? Caladrius exhaled heavily, gripping the Moonstone Codex as seawater rushed over their feet. We'll find another way, he said, forcing the words out. We have to. Luthiel's laughter echoed in the distance, lost in the crash of the waves. The ruins of Ithmar had given them their answers. But now they were stranded in the middle of the ocean, with no way home, and the forces of Naggarond and Chaos both closing in. Chapter 10. The Choice of Fate. The sea was vast, endless, and indifferent. Caladrius sat cross-legged on the damp deck of their stolen Druchii vessel, the scent of salt and charred wood thick in the air. The wind tugged at his robes as he pored over the Moonstone Codex, its luminescent script shifting beneath his fingers like liquid silver. For hours, perhaps days, he had studied its pages, searching for answers, and at last he had found one. Fate is a blade, not a chain. Thalion sat nearby, sharpening his spear with slow, deliberate strokes, his expression unreadable. "Tell me you found something useful," he muttered. Caladrius hesitated, his hands tightening around the edges of the ancient tome. The prophecy is not inevitable. Thalion stopped, mid-matemat, his sharp golden eyes snapping toward him. "Say that again." "The Song of the Stars is not a fixed destiny," Caladrius said, his voice firm despite the storm in his mind. "The alignment of the weeping moon, the sword of Cain, the fate written in the heavens, it all can be changed." Thalion frowned. "You mean we've been running halfway across the world for nothing?" Caladrius shook his head. "No. We've been led to believe fate is unchangeable, but that's a lie. The cult of the Bleeding Moon wants us to believe in an inevitable doom, because that belief is what gives them power. They are trying to shape fate in their favor." Thalion exhaled, running a hand down his face. "Great. And how exactly do we stop them?" Caladrius turned a page, his breath catching as he read the final passage. "The summoning of the first moon approaches. The song must be sung in full, or the world shall drown in the echoes of its final verse." He looked up, eyes wide with realization. The cult is preparing a ritual, one that will summon a daemon prince strong enough to anchor Ulthuan's destruction into reality. Thalion swore under his breath. "The Codex doesn't say. But there's only one place powerful enough for such a ritual." They locked eyes. Lothern, a desperate voyage. The Druchii ship cut through the waves like a blade, its sails tattered but still holding. The dark elves had been meticulous in crafting their warships, sleek, fast, and made for killing. And now it would carry its former prey back to Ulthuan's heart. Caladrius leaned against the railing, the wind lashing at his face. They had little time, perhaps days at best, before the cult's ritual reached its climax. If they failed, if the daemon was summoned, Ulthuan's doom would be sealed. Thalion stood beside him, arms crossed, his expression thoughtful. "Tell me something, Caladrius," he said. "If the prophecy isn't inevitable, how do we rewrite it?" Caladrius exhaled slowly. That was the question that had haunted him ever since he had read the truth within the Codex's pages. "The Codex speaks of an ancient artifact, the Starheart," he murmured. "It was lost when Ithmar sank, but its power still lingers somewhere in Ulthuan." "And what exactly does it do?" Thalion asked. "It is multijuatory," Caladrius said carefully. "It has the power to reshape the fate written in the stars. If the cult uses it, they can force the prophecy to come true, but if we get to it first, we can break their hold on fate itself." Thalion smirked. Now that sounds useful. Caladrius nodded, his grip tightening on the codex. If we find it first, we end this prophecy before it can be fulfilled. Thalion's smirk faded, his expression turning serious. And if we don't? Caladrius looked toward the distant horizon, where the towers of Lothern would soon rise into view. Then Ulthuan burns. The sea roared around them as they sailed toward their fate, toward the final battle for Ulthuan's soul. Chapter 11. Return to a Doomed Land. The towers of Ulthuan rose from the horizon like ivory spires piercing the sky, their radiance untouched by time. But as Caladrius and Thalion drew closer to the shimmering coast, they saw the truth hidden beneath the beauty. The air was wrong. Storm clouds gathered over the northern reaches, twisting in unnatural patterns. Faint, flickering lights pulsed in the distance, arcane fires consuming what remained of the once proud city of Tor Anlak. The cult had begun their work, and if they were not stopped, Ulthuan's doom would be sealed. The ruins of Tor Anlak. The blackened ruins of Tor Anlak stood in stark defiance of time, their shattered walls half consumed by creeping vines and salt-laden winds. Long ago this place had been a fortress, a bastion of Nagariti, before it fell into ruin, abandoned to the ghosts of the past. Now it was a place of blood and shadow. From the safety of a rocky outcrop overlooking the ruined city, Caladrius and Thalion crouched, their gazes fixed on the ritual unfolding below. Hundreds of cultists, cloaked in crimson and black, moved in silent, rhythmic unison, their voices chanting in a language older than time. At the heart of their gathering stood a vast, twisting monolith, its surface carved with blasphemous sigils that pulsed with a sickly glow. And above it the sky split open. A great tear in reality, a swirling vortex of darkness and crimson light, loomed over the ruins. From within something moved, a presence so vast, so utterly inhuman, that it made the very air vibrate with power. Caladrius clenched his fists. "They are calling it forth," he whispered. Thalion's grip tightened on his spear. "The Daemon Prince?" Caladrius nodded. "The prophecy is being forced into reality. If they complete the ritual, the Song of the Stars will no longer be a choice. It will be an ending." Thalion exhaled sharply. "So, how do we stop them?" Caladrius's gaze darkened. "We don't. Not yet." Thalion turned to him, frowning. "You want to let this continue?" "No," Caladrius said. "But right now, if we charge in, we die, and the prophecy still comes to pass. We don't just need to stop the ritual, we need to break their hold on fate itself." Thalion studied him, then sighed. "I'm guessing you have an idea." Caladrius took a steadying breath. "The Starheart. The Codex said it was the only thing that could rewrite fate. The cult is trying to use it to solidify their victory, but if we get to it first, we can undo their work before it's complete." Thalion's eyes narrowed. "And where, exactly, do we find this thing?" Caladrius turned to the south. Avalon, the land of the Everqueen. Avalon, the eternal glade, the heart of Ulthuan's magic, a land untouched by the ravages of war. Even as chaos and shadow moved across the world, Avalon remained pure, its golden forests aglow with an otherworldly light. And at its center, hidden within the sanctuary of the Everqueen, lay the Starheart. It had been guarded for thousands of years, kept safe by the priestesses of the Everqueen, elves who served neither king nor court, bound only to the will of the sacred land. It was said that none could take the Starheart by force. Only those deemed worthy could even look upon it, let alone wield its power. Thalion scowled as their ship veered southward, leaving the horrors of Tor Anlak behind. So let me get this straight. We just march into Avalon, a place where outsiders aren't exactly welcome, and ask politely for their most sacred relic? Caladrius sighed. More or less. Thalion ran a hand down his face. I miss the days when the worst thing I had to worry about was following orders. Caladrius gave him a wry look. I thought you were exiled for not following orders. Measles. Their stolen Druki vessel cut through the waves, the scent of pine and magic growing stronger as the golden forests of Avalon appeared on the horizon. The trees, ancient and aglow with ethereal light, whispered, as if sensing their arrival. Caladrius exhaled. If the Everqueen's priestesses do not let us pass, we have already lost. Thalion checked his spear. Then let's make sure they listen. As the ship neared the sacred shores, the sky darkened behind them. The cult's ritual was nearing completion. Time was running out. Chapter 12. The Queen's Warning. The golden forests of Avalon shimmered with an otherworldly light, their ancient trees whispering in tongues older than mortal memory. The air here was thick with power, not the raw, violent magic of war, but something deeper, older, unshaken by the turning of ages. For a moment, as their stolen Druki vessel docked along the sacred shores, Caladrius felt small. Avalon was a land untouched by time. The very air hummed with the lifeblood of Isha, the elven goddess of life and renewal. Even now, with war on the horizon, this place remained untouched, shielded from the outside world by forces no army could break. And yet, even in its beauty, danger lingered. Thalion gripped his spear, his keen eyes scanning the tree line. I don't like this, he muttered. Caladrius closed the Moonstone Codex, tucking it beneath his robes. We are standing in the most sacred land in Ulthuan, Thalion. Exactly, Thalion muttered. Which means we're trespassing. A sudden wind swept through the trees, rustling the golden leaves. The air shifted, alive with presence. Then, as if stepping from the very fabric of the forest, she appeared. The priestess of Avalon. The priestess of Avalon was unlike any elf Caladrius had ever seen. She was tall, regal, draped in flowing emerald and gold robes woven from enchanted silk. Her skin bore a faint glow, as if she were part of the land itself, and in her gaze was the wisdom of centuries. Her hair, braided with silver vines, moved slightly, as if the wind itself followed her command. This was Nalith, High Priestess of Avalon, guardian of the Everqueen's will. You come seeking the Starheart, she said, her voice like the murmur of leaves in the wind. Caladrius straightened. Yes, the fate of Ulthuan depends on it. Nalith's gaze pierced through him, measuring, weighing, deciding. You speak of fate as if it is something you may claim for yourself, she said softly. Fate is a river, Caladrius Starborn, and rivers do not bend easily. Thalion crossed his arms. We don't have time for riddles. The cult of the Bleeding Moon is summoning a Daemon Prince. If we don't stop them, there won't be an Ulthuan left to protect. Nalith turned to him, eyes unreadable. And you believe the Starheart is the answer? Caladrius nodded. The Codex speaks of its power. If we reach it before the cult does, we can rewrite the prophecy. We can stop this before it is too late. For a long moment, Nalith said nothing. Then she spoke. The Starheart is real, she admitted. But it is not the salvation you believe it to be. Caladrius' heart tightened. What do you mean? A power unstable. Nalith stepped forward, her robes brushing the golden leaves beneath her feet. The Starheart was forged before even the first Phoenix King took the throne, she said. It is not merely a relic, it is a fragment of the heavens, bound in mortal form. Caladrius' pulse quickened. Then it does hold power over fate. It does, Nalith confirmed. "But fate is not meant to be wielded." She raised her hand, and the wind stirred, forming a circle of swirling golden leaves around them. Within the spiral, images appeared, flickering like echoes of the past. Caladrius saw war, battles waged in ages long past, elven kings and queens standing before the Starheart, their faces filled with desperation and greed. He saw them call upon its power, saw the stars shift, and then he saw the cost. Legions of elves burned away in light too bright for the mortal world. Cities consumed in silent oblivion, as if they had never existed. The land itself warped, reshaped in ways never meant to be undone. Caladrius took a step back, his breath unsteady. It destroyed them?" Nalith nodded solemnly. "The Starheart is a shard of the heavens. It does not merely change fate, it unravels it." Silence fell. Thalion exhaled sharply. "Well, that's bad." Caladrius shook his head, his mind racing. "But if the cult gets to it first, they won't care about the consequences. They will force the prophecy to its end, no matter what it destroys." Nalith studied him for a long moment. Then, at last, she sighed. "You are not wrong," she admitted. "The cult of the Bleeding Moon seeks the Starheart, and if they reach it before you, they will use it to bind Ulthuan's doom into reality." She turned, her gaze drifting toward the deep woods beyond the sacred glade. "The Starheart lies hidden in the heart of Avalon," she continued. "But it is not unguarded. It is protected by the children of Aisha, the enchanted beasts who serve as its eternal sentinels." Caladrius's stomach tightened. "Beasts," Thalion echoed. Nalith met his gaze. "Not beasts, Captain Brightspear. Avatars of the forest itself." The trees rustled as if in response. Golden eyes flickered in the distance, half seen among the ancient trunks. The air shifted, and Caladrius suddenly felt watched, not by elves, but by something far older. "The Everqueen herself dares not disturb the Starheart," Nalith continued. "But you would take it into your hands, believing you can shape destiny to your will?" Caladrius hesitated. Thalion exhaled. "Look, I get it. Sacred relic, divine punishment. The gods don't like mortals messing with fate, but right now the cult of the Bleeding Moon is tearing a hole in the world. If we don't use the Starheart to stop them, then nothing else will matter." Nalith studied them both, her gaze unreadable. Then, at last, she nodded. "Very well," she said. "But know this, if you take the Starheart, it will change you. It will rewrite you. No one who has ever touched its power has left it unchanged." Caladrius clenched his fists. "Then let's hope we don't have to use it." Nalith's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "You are already lost to it, seer," she whispered. Then she turned, leading them into the heart of the forest, where ancient forces stirred, and where fate itself waited. Chapter 13. The Trial of Avalon. The heart of Avalon was unlike anything Caladrius had ever known. As he followed Priestess Nalith through the enchanted forest, he felt the air grow thick with unseen power. The golden trees swayed in a wind that did not touch the mortal world, and whispers, soft, ethereal, and ancient, echoed through the leaves. The land was alive, and it was watching. Thalion walked beside him, his grip tight on his spear, his gaze flicking warily toward the shadows between the trees. "Tell me again why this is a good idea," he muttered. "Because we don't have a choice," Caladrius replied, forcing his voice to stay steady. Ahead, Nalith stopped at the base of a massive silver tree, its roots coiling into the earth like grasping fingers. She turned, her gaze solemn. "The Starheart lies within," she said. "But it will not yield itself willingly. To claim it, You must face the spirit of the wild." Caladrius frowned. "And what, exactly, is that?" Nalith tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something unheard. "A fragment of Avalon itself, a being older than kings and queens, older even than the gods you know. It is a test, seer." She gestured toward a shimmering doorway carved into the tree's base. "Only one may enter." Caladrius took a slow breath, stepping forward. Thalion grabbed his arm. "Are you sure about this?" Caladrius hesitated for only a moment. "I have to be." Then he stepped through the threshold of fate, the spirit of the wild. The moment he crossed into the chamber, the world changed. Gone was the forest. Gone was the silver tree. Instead, he stood in a vast glade, surrounded by trees so tall they touched the sky, their golden leaves glowing with their own inner light. The air hummed with power, and in the very center of the clearing, a presence stirred. It was not a beast, it was not an elf. It was something in between. A great antlered figure, its form shifting like mist, neither flesh nor spirit, stood before him. Its eyes glowed with the silver light of the moon, and its voice, when it spoke, was like the rustling of ancient leaves. "You seek the Starheart." Caladrius swallowed. "Yes." The spirit tilted its head. "And would you wield a power you do not understand?" "I would wield it to save Ulthuan," Caladrius answered. The spirit regarded him for a long moment. Then it stepped forward, and the air shuddered with its presence. "Prove your worth, seer." The glade exploded into motion. "The trial begins." Caladrius barely had time to react before the ground trembled, the roots of the great trees tearing free from the earth. They lashed toward him like serpents, seeking to bind him, consume him. He moved on instinct, tracing a sigil of protection in the air. A burst of starlight energy surged outward, burning away the encroaching roots. But the spirit was not done. The air shifted, and suddenly beasts of shadow and moonlight erupted from the glade, wolves with eyes like burning silver, their fangs bared as they leapt toward him. Caladrius whispered an incantation, summoning a shield of celestial force, but the wolves did not stop. They tore through his wards like they were made of paper, forcing him back, pushing him toward the edge of the glade. This is the fate of all who grasp at power they do not comprehend. The spirit intoned, "You will break before the weight of destiny." Caladrius clenched his fists. "No!" With a final, desperate push, he unleashed his power, summoning a great torrent of starlight, banishing the wolves in a brilliant burst. The glade trembled, the very air burning with magic. And for a moment there was silence. Then the spirit laughed. "You burn bright, seer, but all light must fade." Before Caladrius could react, the spirit reached out, its antlered form twisting into shadow, and plunged its hand into his chest. Caladrius gasped as a searing pain lanced through him. He felt his magic being drained, his very soul pulled toward the spirit's grasp. "You would claim the Starheart? Then bear its burden?" The world shattered. The price of power. When Caladrius awoke, he was on his knees in the clearing. The spirit was gone, but before him, resting upon a pedestal of moonstone, lay the Starheart. It was beautiful, a crystal of pure celestial energy, its core pulsing with the light of the heavens. Slowly, painfully, he reached out and took it. The moment his fingers closed around the relic, his body shook. Magic, pure and limitless, coursed through him, more power than he had ever known. And then, just as suddenly, it drained from him. He gasped, feeling the loss like a blade to the heart. His magic, his very essence, was being pulled into the Starheart. The spirit's voice echoed in his mind. "The power of the stars is not given freely. Every time you wield it, it will take from you, until there is nothing left." Caladrius clenched his jaw. This was the cost. But he had no choice. Taking a shaking breath, he rose to his feet, clutching the Starheart to his chest. It was done. He had won the trial. But at what price? As the glade faded and the real world returned, he saw Thalion and Nalith standing over him, their expressions mixed with relief and concern. Thalion smirked. "You look like you just got hit by a dragon." Caladrius exhaled. "It feels worse." Nalith's gaze dropped to the Starheart, now pulsing faintly in his grasp. "You have claimed it," she murmured. "But the cost will be yours alone to bear." Caladrius nodded slowly, staring into the swirling light within the crystal. The power to change fate was now in his hands, and it was already killing him. Chapter 14. The Cult Strikes. The Starheart pulsed in Caladrius's grasp, its light both beautiful and terrifying. He could still feel its power coursing through him, but every time he tried to grasp it, to reach for its depths, it pulled something from him in return, his magic, his strength, perhaps even his very soul. But there was no time to dwell on the price he had paid, because the cult of the Bleeding Moon had found them. The silent killers. The golden forests of Avalon stretched around them, seemingly endless, but Caladrius felt it, a presence in the air, a wrongness that did not belong to the sacred land. They were being watched. Thalion sensed it too. His spear was already in hand, his golden eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. Nalith, her face pale from the burden of guiding them through the Everqueen's lands, stiffened. The wind whispered through the trees, a voice unheard by most, and she closed her eyes as if listening. Then she froze. "Move," she whispered. "Now." A shadow leapt from the trees. Thalion reacted first, his spear flashing, intercepting the assassin in midair. The masked cultist, cloaked in deep crimson, their armor slick with dark runes, hissed as the spear drove through his chest. But instead of falling, the assassin twisted unnaturally, moving as if his bones were not his own. "Magic," Thalion snarled, ripping his weapon free. The assassin fell, but more followed. They came from all sides, blades flashing, whispers of chaotic incantations curling through the air. These were not mere zealots, they were trained killers, infused with the dark blessings of their unholy gods. The cult of the Bleeding Moon had come for the Starheart. The battle in the woods. Caladrius barely had time to summon a warding sigil before a pair of cultists lunged for him. He threw his hands forward, releasing a burst of celestial energy, but the moment he did, the Starheart drank from him, draining his magic faster than he could control it. Pain seared through his veins and he stumbled. A blade sliced toward his throat. Nalith moved in a blur of emerald robes, intercepting the attack. Golden vines erupted from the ground, ensnaring the assassin and crushing him beneath their grasp. "Do not use the Starheart," she called over the chaos. "It will kill you." Caladrius gritted his teeth, forcing himself not to reach for its power. But it was hard. He could feel it, whispering to him, promising him that a single spell, one true invocation, would end all of this. Just one spell. "No," he told himself. "Not yet." Thalion fought beside them, his spear moving too fast for the eye to follow. He fought like an exiled prince of war, weaving between enemies, cutting down one after another. But for every assassin they killed, more poured from the trees, their masks twisted in ecstatic frenzy, their eyes glowing with moonlit madness. And then, a scream. Nalith's fall. Caladrius turned just in time to see a black dagger bury itself in Nalith's side. The priestess of Avalon gasped, her emerald eyes going wide as the blade sank deep, its runes glowing sickly crimson. Caladrius roared, his magic flaring out uncontrollably, sending a shockwave of light across the battlefield. The assassins staggered, their bodies burning under the celestial force, but it was too late. Naylyth fell. Thalion surged forward, cutting down the assassin who had stabbed her, but the damage was already done. Caladrius dropped to his knees, catching Naylyth before she hit the ground. Blood spilled onto the sacred earth, staining the golden leaves. "Naylyth," Caladrius whispered, his voice shaking. She looked up at him, her breath shallow, her fingers gripping his robe weakly. The wound was beyond healing. The blade had been enchanted, meant not just to wound, but to consume. Even the forest, soaked in the Everqueen's power, could not stop what had been done. She coughed, blood staining her lips, but her eyes were still clear, still filled with the wisdom of Avalon. "Listen to me, seer," she murmured. Caladrius leaned closer, his heart pounding. Her fingers tightened on his robe, and with her final breath she whispered, "Beware the shadowed prince." Then the light left her eyes. The priestess of Avalon was dead. The shadowed prince. The world seemed too still, too quiet. Caladrius felt something break inside him. Not grief, not rage. Something worse. A name had been given to the shadows lurking at the edge of this prophecy. The Shadowed Prince. A name that had not been in the Codex, nor in the legends of old. A name that should not exist, but did. Thalion placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice grim. "We have to go. More will come." Caladrius looked down at Naylyth's lifeless body, then at the Starheart, still pulsing in his grasp. Where the Shadowed Prince? He clenched his fists. No more running. He stood, turning toward the ashen horizon, where the cult's ritual continued in the ruins of Tor Alec. "Let's finish this," he said, and the Starheart burned in his hands. Chapter 15. Betrayal in Lothern. The gates of Lothern stood tall and shining beneath the twilight sky, their ivory towers reflecting the last light of the setting sun. But for Caladrius and Thalion, there was no welcome here. As their stolen Druki vessel cut through the harbor waters, tension weighed heavy between them. Caladrius clutched the Starheart beneath his cloak, its presence a constant pull against his very soul. Every moment he held it, he felt it feeding off him, draining his power like a bottomless well. But the cult of the Bleeding Moon was days away from completing their ritual. There was no time to hide, no time to ask permission. They had to act. An unwelcome arrival. As they stepped onto the great piers of Lothern, the city guards were already waiting. Dozens of warriors clad in the gleaming silver and blue of Ulthuan's army formed an impenetrable line across the docks. Caladrius slowed his pace, eyes narrowing. "Something is wrong." Thalion let out a humorless chuckle. "You mean aside from the part where we're arriving in a stolen Druki warship?" Before Caladrius could respond, a voice rang out over the gathered soldiers. "Seize them." The command came from the steps of the White Tower's embassy, and the voice was one Caladrius knew too well. Valor's Sunwhisper. His former mentor stood in flowing golden robes, his presence as regal as ever. But something was wrong. His normally sharp eyes were dull, his expression too calm, too cold. Caladrius barely had time to react before the guards surged forward. Thalion cursed and reached for his spear, but Caladrius stopped him. No, not here. They could not fight the Phoenix Guard in the open streets of Lothern, not when the city was already teetering on the brink of disaster. Reluctantly, Thalion lowered his weapon. The moment they surrendered, the guards forced them to their knees, binding their hands with enchanted silver chains, suppressing Caladrius's magic. As they were dragged before Valor, the Archmage's gaze remained unreadable. "You were warned, Caladrius," he said, his tone heavy with disappointment. Caladrius gritted his teeth. "Ulthuan is on the edge of destruction, and you're wasting time on politics?" Velos' expression did not change. You have stolen from the White Tower. You have consorted with exiles and traitors. You have broken our laws. Because no one else would listen. Caladrius snapped. The cult is preparing to summon a daemon prince. They are shaping the prophecy to force our doom upon us. Valor sighed, shaking his head. You are blinded by superstition, as so many before you were. He turned to the gathered council members who had assembled behind him. The evidence is clear. Caladrius Starborn is guilty of treason. Thalion's expression darkened. You're making a mistake. Valor looked at him, then at Caladrius. Do you think you are the first to claim a grand destiny, the first to believe that the heavens have given you a special role in history? We have seen such arrogance before. Caladrius clenched his fists. This isn't about me. This is about saving Ulthuan. Valor's gaze sharpened, and for the first time Caladrius saw something beneath the surface. A shadow lurking in his former mentor's eyes. Something whispering to him. And then he understood. You're one of them. A ripple of unease passed through the assembled council, but Valor did not flinch. He merely smiled. Perhaps you are not as blind as I thought, he mused. But it does not matter. You have sealed your fate, seer. He raised a hand, and the Phoenix Guard drew their blades. You will be executed at dawn. Caladrius's blood turned to ice. Thalion lunged forward, but the gods held him back. You're making a damned mistake, Valor. Valor ignored him, his gaze still locked on Caladrius. The prophecy will unfold as it was always meant to. You cannot change it. You never could. Caladrius met his former mentor's gaze, defiant even in chains. Then you have already lost. Valor's smile faded. Take them away. The last thing Caladrius saw before the guards dragged him into the darkness was the city of Lothern, still gleaming beneath the stars, blissfully unaware of the doom that crept ever closer. Chapter 16. The Great Escape. The dungeons beneath Lothern were a place of forgotten souls, a maze of cold stone corridors where traitors and prisoners alike were left to fade into silence. Caladrius sat against the damp wall of his cell, his wrists still bound in silver chains, his magic a faint ember beneath their suppression. Across from him, in a separate cell, Thalion Brightspear paced, his jaw clenched in frustration. An execution at dawn, Thalion muttered, shaking his head. I should have expected that old snake Valor to pull something like this. Caladrius exhaled slowly, forcing his mind to focus past the despair. We have until sunrise to get out of here. Thalion snorted. I assume you have a plan? I was hoping you did. The warrior rolled his shoulders. Well, we're off to a fantastic start. Then, before Caladrius could respond, there was a faint clang from the corridor outside their cells. The sound of a guard collapsing. Thalion and Caladrius exchanged looks. And then, a familiar voice drifted through the dim light. I really should start charging you for these rescues, Brightspear. The old comrades. The figure who stepped into view was tall, clad in a scarred breastplate, his silver hair tied in a loose knot. A wry smirk played across his face as he knelt to pick the keys from the fallen guard. Caleth Shadow Dancer. Thalion let out a breathless laugh. Caleth, you bastard! I thought you'd left Ulthuan for good. Caleth unlocked Thalion's cell, then moved to Caladrius's. I had, he admitted. But when I heard my favorite exiled captain was getting himself executed for treason, I figured I'd pay one last visit. Caladrius flexed his wrists as the chains fell away, feeling his magic slowly return. I assume you didn't come alone? Caleth smirked. Not at all. Behind him, more figures emerged from the shadows, a small band of hardened warriors, their armor a mismatched mix of Ulthuan and exile, warriors who had fought battles beyond the sight of the Phoenix throne. Thalion's old comrades. "We've got about 10 minutes before the next patrol," Calith continued, tossing Thalion a short sword. "So unless you'd like to spend your last hours in this lovely cell, I suggest we move." Thalion caught the weapon and turned to Caladrius. "Well, seer, shall we?" Caladrius tightened his grip on the Starheart, feeling its weight against his soul. "Let's go." Breaking out of the White Tower, they moved quickly through the twisting passages, taking down any guards in their path silently and efficiently. Calith led them through hidden tunnels, routes known only to those who had spent a lifetime slipping through the cracks of Ulthuan's perfect order. As they reached the outer gates, the alarms began to ring. "They know we're gone," Calith muttered. Thalion smirked. "Took 'em long enough." Caladrius raised his hands, whispering a glyph of concealment, weaving the magic just before the Phoenix Guard rounded the corner. The soldiers rushed past them, completely unaware, their focus on the cells behind them. "It won't last long," Caladrius whispered. "Then we don't stop moving," Thalion replied. They slipped onto the docks, where a sleek elven warship lay waiting, Calith's stolen prize. Its sails were unfurled, its crew ready for departure. Caladrius barely had time to breathe before Calith turned to him. "I hope you know where we're sailing, seer." Caladrius met his gaze. "To Tor Anlech. The cult's ritual is almost complete." Calith grimaced. "Of course it is." Thalion clapped his old friend on the shoulder. "You weren't planning to live forever, were you?" Calith sighed. "You owe me for this, Brightspear." With a final shove off the docks, the warship slipped into the sea, cutting through the waves toward the final battle. As the wind howled around them, Caladrius gripped the Starheart, his pulse beating in time with its endless, consuming song. The cult of the Bleeding Moon was waiting, and this time there would be no escape. Chapter 17. The Siege of Tor Anlech. The storm before the battle. The blackened ruins of Tor Anlech loomed before them, shrouded in mist and shadow. The once proud fortress of Nagarite, abandoned for centuries, now served as the heart of the cult's corruption. Above it, the sky was breaking. A swirling maelstrom of crimson and black churned above the ruins, tendrils of darkness stretching toward the heavens like the grasping fingers of a dying god. The air hummed with raw magic, charged with the weight of an impending disaster. From the deck of their stolen warship, Caladrius and Thalion watched the unfolding horror. Even from this distance, they could feel the power gathering within the ruins. The demon prince was almost here. Caladrius clenched his fists, the Starheart pulsing against his chest. He could hear it whispering, offering him the power to end this, but he knew the cost. "We're out of time," Thalion muttered, adjusting his grip on his spear. "We need to hit them now." Calith, standing beside them, let out a low curse. "We're what, 30 warriors against a fortress of cultists? This is madness." Thalion smirked. "Then it's a good thing madness is my specialty." Calith groaned. "I should have stayed in exile." Caladrius turned to the gathered warriors, exiles, outcasts, and the last loyalists of Ulthuan willing to fight. Their faces were grim, their blades ready. "The cult believes they have already won," Caladrius said. "We show them they are wrong." He raised the Starheart, its light burning through the mist. "Tonight, we break their prophecy." The warriors let out a silent vow, their blades reflecting the unnatural glow of the storm. Then the ship surged toward the ruins of Tor Anlech, breaking the gates. The moment they reached the shore, the cult's sentry spotted them. A howling alarm echoed through the ruins, and within seconds the shoreline was ablaze with sorcery. Bolts of crimson lightning streaked through the sky, crashing into the sand with explosive force. "Move!" Thalion roared, leading the charge up the blackened stone ramparts. Their warriors clashed with the cult's defenders, the air filled with the ring of steel and the screams of the dying. Caladrius hurled arcane blasts, weaving between the fighters, cutting down cultists before they could complete their spells. But every time he cast, he felt the Starheart pulling at him, draining him more and more. It was a slow death, a wound that bled every time he touched its power. And yet, he could not stop. Thalion fought like a storm, his spear carving a path through the cultists. Caladrius and his warriors flanked from the side, cutting off the enemy's retreat. For a moment, it seemed like they might turn the tide. Then, the gates of the fortress burst open, and the true battle began. The manifestation begins. A wave of cult fanatics poured out of the ruins, their bodies twisted by dark magic. Some bore unnatural sigils carved into their flesh, their eyes burning with a feverish light. But the real horror was waiting inside. At the heart of the fortress courtyard, surrounded by towering monolithic stones, stood the cult's high priest, his arms raised toward the sky, his voice a chant of summoning. And above him the sky shattered. A rift, vast and unstable, tore through the heavens. From within, something moved, its form shifting and incomplete, a being of pure chaos forcing its way into the world. The Daemon Prince was almost upon them. Caladrius's breath caught. No, we're too late. The cult's leader turned to face them, his lips curled in triumph. His voice, thick with otherworldly echoes, rang through the battlefield. You cannot stop destiny, Seer. Then he thrust his dagger into his own heart, completing the final sacrifice. A pillar of red light erupted from his body, striking the rift above. The earth shook, and a terrible roar echoed through the night. The Daemon Prince was coming. Caladrius's grip tightened on the Starheart. They had one chance left. Thalion, he shouted over the chaos. Thalion met his gaze. Tell me you have a plan. Caladrius lifted the Starheart, its light flaring against the dark. If we cut off the summoning circle, we might be able to seal the rift before the daemon fully manifests. Thalion nodded, already moving. Then we take the fight to the summoners. Caladrius cursed. You two are going to get me killed. Thalion grinned. Probably. Then, together, they charged into the storm, toward the final battle for Ulthuan's soul. Chapter 18. The Starheart's Price. The sky above Tor Anlek was breaking apart. The summoning circle pulsed with unnatural crimson light, its runes twisting and shifting in the air as if they were alive. Above it the rift had grown larger, spilling forth tendrils of chaos, raw and writhing, reaching into the mortal world. The Daemon Prince was almost through. Caladrius stood at the edge of the battlefield, the Starheart pulsing in his grasp, its light the only thing pushing back against the growing darkness. But with every heartbeat he felt it. The cost, the weight, the unbearable pull. Each time he used the Starheart it took something from him. Not just his magic. Something deeper. Something irreplaceable. The choice of power. Thalion fought like a storm unleashed, his spear cutting through the cultists as he and the loyalists carved a path toward the summoning circle. But for every foe they struck down, more took their place. The cultists fought with fanatic strength, their bodies twisting with unholy power, their eyes glowing with the madness of those who had already given themselves to the void. Caladrius cursed as he dodged a blade, cutting down another robed figure. This is endless. Caladrius knew he was right. They were outnumbered, outmatched. They couldn't win by sheer force alone. There was only one way to stop this. Caladrius clenched his jaw, raising the Starheart. The moment he did, he felt the pull, a hunger, a void that whispered to him, urging him to surrender, to give in, to let it take more. Beneath these spell, the Starheart seemed to whisper, just one true invocation, and this battle will end. The temptation was unbearable. The battlefield blurred as he whispered an incantation, calling upon the full power of the Starheart. Light, bright and terrible, exploded outward, searing through the battlefield. Cultists screamed as their bodies disintegrated, burned away by the celestial force. The air shook, the very foundations of the fortress cracking under the pressure of his spell. The summoning circle wavered, its energy faltering. For a moment, hope surged through him. Then pain ripped through his soul. The cost of power. Caladrius collapsed to his knees, gasping. It was as if something inside him had shattered, not just his magic but his very essence. His hands trembled, his vision blurred, his heartbeat unsteady. The Starheart had taken something from him, and he did not know if he would ever get it back. Thalion saw him fall and rushed to his side, slamming his spear into the ground to steady himself. Caladrius, what the hell was that? Caladrius struggled to breathe. His body was still intact, but he felt less. Every time I use it. He swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. It takes from me. He bent. Calith cursed, cutting down another enemy as he turned toward them. Tell me you're not saying what I think you're saying. Caladrius forced himself to stand, gripping the Starheart tighter. He could still feel its power, but he knew if he used it again, if he pushed one step further, there might be nothing left of him. But the summoning was not undone. The rift above still pulsed, still beckoned something horrible into the world, and he knew what had to be done. Thalion caught his gaze, eyes narrowing. You're thinking of using it again, aren't you? Caladrius nodded, his fingers tightening around the Starheart. If I don't, the daemon will manifest fully, and then Ulthuan is finished. Thalion exhaled, his grip on his spear tightening. You don't know what happens if you push too far. Caladrius met his gaze. I do. A beat of silence. Then Thalion nodded once. Then I guess we finish this together. Caladrius turned toward the summoning circle, toward the rift that still hung open, toward the final battle waiting ahead. The Starheart burned in his hands, and he stepped forward, ready to pay whatever price was left to give. Chapter 20. A Battle in the Stars. The rift above Tor Anlik widened, its churning abyss spilling tendrils of raw chaos into the world. The very air screamed as the Daemon Prince's form solidified, its vast, twisted limbs stretching toward the mortal plane. It was almost here. Caladrius staggered, the Starheart burning in his grasp. His vision blurred, his body felt weightless, as if part of him was already slipping away. He had only one chance left. And he knew the cost. The breaking of the ritual. The shadowed prince stood at the edge of the summoning circle, his gaze serene despite the carnage around him. This is your last chance, seer, he said, his voice cutting through the roar of the storm. Join me, and you will not have to die for a dying world. Caladrius' fingers clenched around the Starheart, his breath coming in short gasps. He could feel it, the endless hunger within the relic, the pull of something greater than fate itself. He could reshape destiny. He could seize control of the stars. But at what cost? His gaze flickered toward Thalion and Calith, still fighting desperately against the last of the cultists. The battlefield was drenched in blood, and the very foundations of Ulthuan trembled beneath the weight of what was coming. He looked up at the demonic form descending from the void, its eyes like twin burning moons, its laughter shaking the heavens. Then he made his choice. Caladrius lifted the Starheart high. The shadowed prince's expression darkened. No. Caladrius spoke the final words of power. The collapse of fate. Light, a pillar of silver radiance, erupted from the Starheart, cutting through the sky like a divine blade. The very stars above seemed to shake, their patterns unraveling as the raw force of celestial power surged outward. The summoning circle shattered. The runes, once burning with chaos, collapsed, their power severed. The demon prince let out a scream, its form twisting and breaking as the rift began to collapse around it. The shadowed prince roared, stepping forward, but it was too late. The ritual was destroyed. The storm imploded, the sky itself folding inward, pulling everything into the consuming abyss. The cultists still standing were torn apart, their bodies devoured by the force of their own failed summoning. The ruins of Tor Anilek quaked, great chunks of stone and earth ripping free as the void tried to pull the entire fortress into itself. Caladrius fell to his knees, the Starheart slipping from his grasp, its energy spent, but the damage had already been done. The price had been paid. The end of Caladrius Starborn. Thalion skidded to his side, grabbing him by the shoulders. "Caladrius, stay with me!" Caladrius tried to speak, but the words would not come. His body was fading, his magic burned away, his very being unraveling like starlight in the wind. He had given everything. Caleth staggered toward them, his face bloodied, his voice shaken. "We have to get out of here. The entire fortress is collapsing." The ground beneath them cracked, deep fissures splitting open as the remnants of the summoning spell dragged Tor Alec into the void. Ithmar looked down at his old friend, eyes burning with rage and grief. "Come on, Caladrius. We have to—" But Caladrius knew the truth. He was not going to leave. He was already gone. With the last of his strength, he lifted his gaze to Thalion, forcing a weak smile. "You have to finish this," he whispered. Thalion's expression broke, but he nodded once. "I'll stop him, I swear it." Caladrius exhaled softly, his body weightless, the world around him fading to white. As the last of the fortress crumbled, the Starheart released a final, blinding pulse of light. And Caladrius Starborn was gone. The rift sealed. The collapse ended as suddenly as it had begun. The rift, once vast and endless, vanished, sealed, its energy scattered across the winds of magic. The Demon Prince was no more. The ruins of Tor Anlek lay silent, reduced to nothing but a shattered battlefield, and the shadowed prince stood alone among the wreckage, staring at the spot where Caladrius had vanished. For the first time, his expression was not triumph, not amusement, only fury. The prophecy had been broken. But the game was not over. With a slow breath, the shadowed prince turned away, disappearing into the darkness, his next move already in motion. And far above, the stars burned brighter than ever before. Chapter 21. The Aftermath. A silence over Ulthuan. The ruins of Tor Anlek smoldered beneath the dawn light. Where once the sky had churned with the raw power of chaos, now only silence remained. The rift was gone, its dark tendrils severed by Caladrius's final sacrifice. The cult of the bleeding moon lay in ruins, their twisted ambitions turned to ash. But the cost had been immeasurable. Thalion stood among the broken stones, his spear planted in the dirt, his gaze fixed on the place where Caladrius had vanished. He had seen it happen, had felt the final burst of power, the moment the Starheart had taken the last of him. And now there was nothing left. Ulthuan had been saved, but not without loss. The survivors gather. Caleth approached from the battlefield, his armor streaked with blood, his expression grim. Behind him, the few survivors of the battle moved among the wreckage, helping the wounded, gathering what little remained of their forces. They had won, but they had barely survived. Caleth stopped beside Thalion, following his gaze. "He's really gone," he said quietly. Thalion didn't respond at first. His grip on his spear tightened, his knuckles white with fury. "I shouldn't have had to do it alone," he murmured, voice low. "He shouldn't have." His words broke off, the weight of it hitting him all at once. Caelith let out a slow breath. "He saved us, Thalion. He saved all of Ulthuan." Thalion exhaled sharply, looking away. "Then why does it feel like we lost?" The White Tower, in chaos. The battle had been won, but the war for Ulthuan's future had only begun. Word of Valor's Sunwhisper's betrayal had already spread. The White Tower was in turmoil, their archmages divided, their power shaken by the revelation that one of their own had fallen to the cult's influence. Trust, once unshakable, had been broken. The Phoenix King's court had questions. How had the cult infiltrated so deeply into Ulthuan's nobility? How many more loyalists had secretly turned their allegiance to the Shadowed Prince? And the most terrifying question of all, was this truly the end? Or had the Shadowed Prince merely laid the foundation for something far worse? The price of victory. Thalion stepped away from the battlefield, walking toward the shore where the ocean waves lapped against the sand. The sea breeze was cold, biting against his skin, but he barely noticed. Caladrius had always looked to the stars, believing they held the answers. But now those same stars burned without him. Caelith joined him, silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. "Feel it now?" Thalion let out a slow breath. He turned his gaze toward the distant horizon where Lothern waited, where the White Tower sat in its turmoil, where Ulthuan stood, saved but not whole. His hand rested on his spear, his jaw set in determination. "Now," he said, "we make sure it was worth it." And as the waves whispered against the shore, the future of Ulthuan remained uncertain. But they would fight for it, no matter the cost. Chapter 22. The Price of Knowledge. A broken prophecy. The song of the stars had not ended. Caladrius Starborn's sacrifice had shattered the cult's ritual, sealing the rift before the demon prince could manifest fully. But the prophecy had not been destroyed, only delayed. Ulthuan still stood, but the heavens had not yet fallen silent. And fate still moved. The White Tower's search. The lore masters of Sapphire gathered in the great halls of the White Tower. Their voices hushed, their expressions filled with doubt. They pored over ancient tomes, consulted the oldest stargazers, traced the paths of the celestial bodies once more. And the answer they found was not what they had hoped for. The prophecy remained unfinished. The weeping moon had begun its descent. The alignment had been broken, but the song of the stars still whispered on the wind. The celestial markers had shifted, but they had not stopped moving. The doom of Ulthuan had not been averted, only postponed. Thalion's burden. Standing on the balconies of Lothern, Thalion Brightspear gazed toward the distant sky, where the constellations had once foretold Ulthuan's end. The stars burned as brightly as ever, but he no longer saw them as a guiding light. He saw them as a warning. "Is it over?" Caelith's voice came from behind him. Thalion didn't turn. "No." A pause. Then Caelith stepped beside him, his expression unreadable. "The White Tower is still in chaos. The Phoenix King's court is arguing over what happens next. Some think we're safe, others think another war is coming." Thalion let out a slow breath. "A war is always coming," Caelith sighed. "And what about you?" Thalion's grip on the Starheart's empty casing tightened. The relic had burned out, its power spent, but he could still feel the weight of it, as if it were still waiting for something. Still holding a secret that had yet to be spoken. His jaw clenched. Caladrius gave everything to stop this. If he failed, then it's on us to make sure Ulthuan survives. Caelith studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then I guess we'd better start watching the skies." Thalion exhaled, his gaze lingering on the cold stars above. Caladrius had paid the price for knowledge. And yet the future still moved. The prophecy was not ended. It was still waiting. Chapter 23, White Tower of Hoeth. The Scholar's Last Words. The White Tower of Hoeth loomed over the shimmering waters of Sapphire, its ivory spires untouched by war, its countless libraries and scroll halls filled with the wisdom of ages. It had been here that Caladrius Starborn had once studied the stars, where he had first seen the prophecy written in the heavens. Now he was gone, and his warnings had come to pass. But the prophecy was not over. Thalion Brightspear strode through the tower's endless corridors, his boots echoing against the polished marble. He had never belonged in a place like this, among scholars and mystics, among men and women who saw the world as lines of script rather than battlefields of blood. And yet, here he was, because Ulthuan was not safe, because Caladrius had left something behind, and because the doom of Ulthuan had only begun. The surviving sages. A handful of mages and lore masters had survived the recent chaos, the corruption of the White Tower, the treason of Valor's Sun Whisper, and the fall of the cult of the Bleeding Moon. Now they gathered in a dimly lit chamber, scrolls and celestial charts spread before them. Their faces were lined with fatigue, their eyes shadowed by doubt. Thalion approached the eldest among them, a venerable sage named Medras the Hollow, who had once been a staunch critic of Caladrius's warnings. He no longer looked so certain. "You wouldn't be here unless you had found something," Thalion said, folding his arms. "Tell me." Medras let out a slow breath. Caladrius was right about many things. Thalion's eyes hardened. But not all of them. The elder mage hesitated, then nodded. "We have consulted the constellations again. The song of the stars has not stopped singing. It has merely changed its melody." Thalion frowned. "Meaning?" Maedras gestured toward an ancient tablet of polished silver, its surface inscribed with newly charted star patterns. The lines no longer matched the prophecy they had feared, the one Caladrius had tried to prevent. "The cult of the Bleeding Moon was only the first movement," Maedras said, his voice heavy with realization. "A single step in a prophecy far grander than we ever understood." Thalion clenched his fists. "Then we were never meant to stop it completely." Medras shook his head. "Only to delay it." The air in the chamber seemed colder. "Then now," the old sage whispered, "the next verse is beginning." Caladrius's final writings. In the depths of the White Tower, within the sanctum where Caladrius had once studied, the scholars had found something else. A single unfinished manuscript. It was Caladrius's final work, his last thoughts before he had left for the ruins of Ithmar, before he had walked into battle for the last time. Thalion ran his fingers over the aged parchment, his chest tightening at the familiar handwriting. The words were incomplete, scattered between rushed notes and frantic calculations, but the final line was clear. "The Shadowed Prince is only the beginning. Something older is waking. Something the stars themselves fear to name." Thalion's pulse quickened. "Do you know what he meant?" he asked the scholars. Maedras hesitated. "Not entirely, but—" He gestured toward the pedestal at the center of the room. Resting upon it was a fragment of the Starheart. It was no longer the vast, burning celestial force it had once been. The artifact had shattered in the final battle, its energy spent in sealing the rift. But a sliver of its essence remained, pulsing faintly with some lingering remnant of Caladrius's magic. "Before he fell," Medras said, "Caladrius bound his last vision into this fragment." Thalion's throat tightened. "Then let's see what he saw." The vision of the Starheart. Thalion stepped forward, placing his hands on the fragment of the Starheart. The moment his fingers touched the crystal, the world fell away. Darkness surged around him, swallowing the room, swallowing time, swallowing all light and sound. Then he saw. The vision burned into the last essence of Caladrius' soul. A vast, endless ruin, stretching beyond the boundaries of mortal comprehension. Towers taller than mountains, broken and crumbling, scattered beneath a sky that was not a sky at all, but an endless chasm, pulsing with shapes that were never meant to be seen. And in the center of it all, a being older than chaos. Not a daemon, not a god, not something from the mortal or immortal realms. Something before, something that had waited, forgotten, while the world fought its petty wars, while gods and mortals played their endless games. And now it was waking. The vision flickered, shifting to another scene. The shadowed prince, standing before something vast and unseen, his form bathed in cold, silver light. His voice echoed through the vision, filled with reverence and certainty. The age of elves is over. The age of the forgotten is about to begin. Thalion gasped, the vision shattering around him. He stumbled back, the fragment of the Starheart pulsing one last time before dimming forever. He was breathing hard, his mind reeling. Maedra steadied him, his old hands shaking. "What did you see?" Thalion looked up, his face pale, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. "We stopped the cult," he whispered. "But something else is coming." Maedros exhaled slowly, as if he had feared those exact words. "Then we are still bound to the prophecy," he murmured. Thalion looked toward the open balcony, where the stars still shone in their endless patterns. Caladrius had given everything to stop one fate. But a greater doom still loomed over Ulthuan. And for the first time since the battle at Tor Anlik, Thalion felt true fear, because the stars were still singing, and this time their song held no mercy. Chapter 24. The Shattered Prophecy. Into the Land of Shadows. The winds of Nagari carried whispers of the dead. Once, this land had been the beating heart of a proud elven kingdom. Before the sundering, before the war that split their people, before the name Nagari became synonymous with betrayal and ruin. Now, it was a wasteland of shadows. Blackened cliffs loomed over the ashen plains, their jagged peaks wreathed in eternal mist. The ruins of long-fallen fortresses lay half-buried in the cursed earth, their stones scorched by the madness of a war fought thousands of years ago. And yet Nagari was not empty. It had never been empty. Some still lived here, watching from the darkness, waiting, the shadow blades of the lost kin. Thalion Brightspear walked through the ruins with measured steps, his spear gripped loosely in his hand. He was being watched. He had known it since he had set foot on this accursed land. But he was not here to fight. He was here for answers. At last the silence broke. Figures stepped from the mist, moving like specters in the half-light. Black cloaks, masks, adorned with faded sigils of old Nagari, their armor unmarked, worn only for function, not for pride. The shadow blades of the lost kin. Not Drukei, not Asur. Elves who had refused both paths, who had abandoned Malekith when he turned against their people, yet had also been cast out by the Phoenix throne, seen as remnants of a broken past. They had no home, no king, no allies, but they had secrets, and Thalion had come to claim them. A prophecy rewritten. One of the Shadowblades stepped forward, a woman clad in blackened silver armor, her face half hidden behind a mask of obsidian. "You tread on cursed ground, Ashur," she said, her voice like the whisper of a dagger through silk. Thalion did not flinch. "And yet you let me walk this far." A pause. Then the woman inclined her head. "We know who you are. Thalion Brightspear, exile, traitor to the Phoenix throne." Thalion smirked. Takes one to know one. A brief silence. Then the Shadowblade laughed softly. You are here for the prophecy, she said. The song of the stars. Thalion's expression darkened. You know of it. The Shadowblade gestured for him to follow. We do. And we know its true origin. A history stained in lies. The Shadowblades led Thalion through the ruins of an ancient keep, its walls carved with symbols that had long been forgotten by the White Tower. They stopped before an altar of obsidian, upon which lay a single, aged scroll bound in dark silver. The prophecy you fight against, the Shadowblade said, is a lie. Thalion's blood ran cold. The Shadowblade placed a gloved hand on the scroll. The Song of the Stars was not written by fate alone. It was tampered with, twisted long ago, during the days of the sun. Thalion's grip on his spear tightened. By who? The Shadowblade's expression hardened. The Druchi. A bitter silence fell. The prophecy once foretold an age of renewal for Ulthuan, the Shadowblade continued. But Malekith's sorcerers, in their endless hatred, used the darkest arts of Nagaroth to corrupt it, to bind Ulthuan's fate to doom. They did not simply seek to conquer our homeland. They sought to rewrite its destiny, to ensure that no matter how the centuries passed, no matter what battles were fought, Ulthuan would eventually fall. Thalion exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Then everything. His voice was tight. Everything Caladrius sacrificed to stop was only delaying the inevitable. The Shadowblade finished for him. Thalion's jaw clenched. He had suspected that their victory at Tor Anlik had not been enough, that there had been something more, something deeper, lurking beneath the prophecy. But this was worse than he imagined. The Druchi had not just predicted Ulthuan's doom. They had engineered it. The Shadowed Prince's legacy. The Shadowblade turned, stepping away from the altar. Caladrius broke the first chain, she said. But there are more, and one still remains who would see the prophecy fulfilled. Thalion's gaze snapped up. The Shadowed Prince, he murmured. The Shadowblade nodded. He is gone, but his legacy is not. Thalion's pulse quickened. Who? The Shadowblade gestured toward the dark horizon. The Shadowed Prince was not just a man, he was a herald, a forerunner of something greater, and before his fall he left behind an heir. Thalion's breath caught. Someone else was out there. Someone who still held the secrets of the prophecy, who still sought to reshape the stars in their own image. Thalion turned toward the ashen sky, the weight of the truth settling deep in his chest. Ulthuan's doom was not averted, and now its true enemy had yet to reveal themselves. The prophecy had been shattered, but the war for fate itself was only beginning. Chapter 25. The Return of the Forgotten. Shadows over Ulthuan. It began as whispers. Rumors carried by merchants from Kothik, by warriors returning from distant shores, by mages whose visions had grown uneasy. Something was happening, but no one could say exactly what. Ships vanished along the northern coasts. Entire villages disappeared without a trace, their halls untouched, their food still on the tables, but their people gone. Strange auras of power rippled across the ley lines of Ulthuan's magic, pulsing with something ancient, but alien. And then the first attack came. The siege of Lothern's outposts. The watchtowers of Lothern, standing tall along the northern shores, were the first to fall. The sentinels of the Phoenix King had been watching for Druchi raiders, for chaos warbands, for pirates and heretics. But what came from the mists of the sea was something else entirely. A fleet of warships, unlike any seen in thousands of years, emerged from the great ocean, not crude, drucky-eye black arcs, nor the monstrous crafts of chaos, but sleek, silver-gilded vessels, their prows shaped like serpents of forgotten legend. Before the garrisons could react, bolts of pure energy erupted from the enemy warships, not fire, not lightning, but something older, something shaped by the will of gods long thought dead. The elven defenses crumbled. Not a single warning signal was sent to Lothern before the outposts fell silent. Ulthuan had new invaders, an enemy unlike any before. Thalion Brightspear barely survived the ambush. He and a band of warriors had been tracking reports of disappearances near the cliffs of northern Etine, believing it to be a remnant of the cult of the Bleeding Moon, perhaps another cell lurking in the shadows. Instead, they walked into something far worse. The attackers moved like ghosts, striking from the mists, clad in ornate silver armor, their weapons glowing with runes that no high elf had seen in millennia. Their movements were flawless, their magic beyond understanding, spells that twisted the very air itself, that shattered stone without effort. One by one, Thalion's warriors fell, not to brute force, but to perfect precision. Thalion fought like a storm, his spear cutting through the strange warriors, but they anticipated his every move, countering not with brute strength, but with knowledge, as if they had been studying him for lifetimes. And then he saw one of their faces. Beneath their ornate helms, beneath their alien sigils, their unnatural weapons, they were elves, but not Ashur, not Truki, not anything that should still exist. The true rulers of Ulthuan. Thalion barely managed to escape, his body battered, his mind reeling. He stumbled through the ruined cliffs, into the shadows of a shattered tower, where he could finally breathe. The strange warriors did not follow. They had not needed to, because they had already won. As Thalion crouched behind the fallen stones, he listened to their words, their voices speaking in a dialect of Eltherin that was ancient, yet strangely untouched by time. "The Asur have grown weak," one of them said. "Ventpik squander the gifts of the Old Ones. It is time for Ulthuan to be reborn, under its true rulers." A cold chill ran through Thalion's veins. This was not a mere invasion. This was a return. A lost faction of elves, hidden for millennia, forgotten by history itself, now emerging from the depths of the great ocean. And they believed they were the rightful heirs of Ulthuan. A war unlike any before. Thalion forced himself to his feet, gripping his spear with white-knuckled hands. Ulthuan had faced Druchii sorcery, chaos warhosts, and divine calamity. But this was something new. The enemy did not fight like raiders, nor conquerors, nor even worshippers of chaos. They fought with purpose, with knowledge, wielding artifacts of the Old Ones, technology that rivaled the greatest minds of the White Tower. They were not here to destroy Ulthuan. They were here to take it back. Thalion exhaled, the weight of the revelation sinking into him. Ulthuan's doom had always seemed to come from without, from Nagaroth, from chaos, from treachery within the courts of Lothern. But what if the greatest threat had been waiting beneath the waves all along? What if the stars had never spoken of destruction, but of an unmaking? The prophecy was still alive, and now a new war had begun. Chapter 26. The Gathering Storm. Chaos in the court of the Phoenix King. The throne room of Lothern was filled with voices raised in anger and fear. The lords of Ulthuan, gathered in a hastily summoned council, spoke over one another, some demanding swift action, others urging caution, but none agreeing. At the head of the chamber, beneath the golden banners of the Phoenix throne, the Phoenix King sat silent, his expression unreadable as the great houses of Ulthuan turned on one another. Thalion Brightspear stood at the edge of the chamber, watching the disaster unfold. The attack on Lothern's outposts could not be ignored. Entire garrisons had been wiped out, yet no Druchii fleet had come, no Chaos warbands had landed on Ulthuan shores. Instead, a forgotten enemy, a lost elven faction, had emerged from the depths of the great ocean, wielding magic and weapons unseen for millennia. And yet, even now, the Phoenix Court refused to listen. A kingdom divided. Lord Arian of Calador, clad in his dragon-forged armor, slammed his fist against the ivory table. "Enough debate. The enemy has struck at our shores, and we sit here whispering like fearful children? We must respond with fire and steel." A murmur of agreement rippled through the war-hardened lords of Calador and Yvresi. But across from them, the archmages of Sapphire stood firm. Loremaster Thalion, his robes shimmering with the sigils of Hoeth, narrowed his gaze. "And what would you have us do, Lord Arian? March blindly into battle against an enemy we do not understand? You speak of war, but this is not the Druchii. We do not even know what they are." A ripple of frustration spread through the chamber. Lord Iltharis of Illyrian, normally a voice of reason, sighed. "We are warriors, not diplomats. If these invaders claim to be the true rulers of Ulthuan, then war will come, whether we wish it or not." Another wave of argument erupted, noble houses taking sides, drawing battle lines with words instead of swords. And still, no decision was made. Thalion gritted his teeth. They were wasting time. A voice unheard. Thalion stepped forward, forcing his voice to cut through the noise. "You are all making a mistake." The chamber fell silent. The lords of Ulthuan turned to face him, some with impatience, others with contempt. Thalion's grip on his spear tightened. "The prophecy has not ended. This invasion is not just another war. It is the next verse of the Song of the Stars." The archmages of Sapphire stirred, uneasy. Lord Arian of Calador snorted. "More prophecies? Are we truly to be led by superstition?" Thalion stepped forward, his gaze hard as steel. "Did prophecy not warn us of the cult of the bleeding moon? Did prophecy not warn us of the shadowed prince? And still you refuse to listen. How many times must we watch the stars burn before you understand that this is not just war? This is fate itself unraveling." The chamber darkened, as if the very winds of magic responded to his words. But the lords of Ulthuan did not. Phoenix Guard moved subtly, their presence a silent warning. Thalion saw the truth in their faces. They would not listen. Not now, not until it was too late. A choice of his own. Thalion turned. He had come here hoping to warn them, to unite Ulthuan before it was too late. But they were blinded by their own pride, by their fear of the unknown. If they would not act, then he would. As he strode from the chamber, Caleth's shadow dancer fell into step beside him. "I assume that went well." Thalion exhaled sharply. "We're leaving." Caleth raised an eyebrow. "And where exactly are we going?" Thalion did not hesitate. "The Starheart," he said. "There are fragments left, and if we find them, we might be able to end this prophecy before it can be fulfilled." Caleth sighed. "So, we're running off into the unknown with no plan, no army, and no support?" Thalion gave him a pointed look. Caleth grinned, just like old times. Behind them, a handful of warriors, those who had fought at Tor Anlach, those who still believed in Caladrius's warnings, followed without question. They were few, but they were enough. As Thalion and his allies slipped into the night, the lords of Ulthuan continued to argue, their kingdom standing at the edge of an abyss. The storm was coming, and this time Thalion would not wait for it to arrive. Chapter 27. The Gate of Eternity. The Forgotten Temples of Eatain. The ruined temples of Eatain stood like silent sentinels, their once grand spires crumbling beneath the weight of millennia. Once, these sacred halls had been devoted to the Old Ones, their magic woven into the very fabric of Ulthuan. Now, they were little more than shattered remnants, forgotten even by the scholars of Hoeth, their secrets buried beneath ash and time. But Thalion Brightspear knew what he sought was here, the gate of eternity, a passage not of stone and steel, but of magic and fate, a doorway beyond the material world, beyond the grasp of gods and kings. It had been sealed for ages, lost to the greatest minds of the White Tower. But now, it stirred once more, and Thalion could feel it calling to him. The gateway to the Song of the Stars. Caleth Shadow Dancer stepped beside him, his eyes narrowed as he traced the faded sigils of ancient power carved into the temple's walls. "This place feels wrong," Caleth muttered, running a gloved hand over the blackened stone. "Like something is watching us." Thalion nodded, gripping his spear tightly. "Not watching. Waiting." He took a step forward, and the air shifted. Beneath the ruined archway, a circular monolith of obsidian pulsed faintly, the old glyphs along its surface flickering to life. The gate of eternity had awakened. Thalion exhaled sharply. This was it, the place where the Song of the Stars was first written. And now he would step beyond it, into the void beyond. The moment Thalion touched the monolith, the world vanished. Time and space unraveled in a whirlwind of light and shadow, the sky bending, twisting, breaking apart like shattered glass. Then, silence. An endless void stretched before him, neither light nor darkness, neither presence nor absence. And yet it was not empty. Thalion felt it. A presence lingering just beyond the edge of reality. A spirit, a voice he had thought lost forever. Thalion, the spirit of Caladrius. Thalion turned, and there, standing in the nothingness, was Caladrius Starborn. His form flickered like a dying star, his once proud robes now fragments of celestial light, shifting as though caught between existence and oblivion. His eyes burned with wisdom, but his expression was tired, burdened by a weight beyond mortal understanding. Thalion's breath caught. "Caladrius." The spirit gave a sad smile. "You should not be here, old friend." Thalion took a step closer, his voice low with disbelief. You died! At Toranik, you—" "I did," Caladrius said softly. "And yet, I am still here." He gestured around them. "This place is beyond life and death, beyond time itself. This is where the Song of the Stars was first written, where fate was woven into the fabric of the world." His gaze turned dark, "and where it is now being unmade." The eternal struggle. Thalion's eyes followed Caladrius's gesture, and for the first time he saw it. Beyond the swirling void something moved. A great monstrous presence, its form shifting constantly, neither daemon nor god, neither shadow nor flame. It pulsed with raw power, its tendrils stretching into the very fabric of the prophecy itself, warping the strands of fate, unraveling and rewriting destiny at its will. Thalion staggered back. "What is that?" Caladrius's expression hardened. As the true enemy. The shadowed prince was a pawn. The cult of the bleeding moon was a distraction. Even the invaders from the sea are only part of the pattern. He turned back to Thalion, his ethereal form flickering. "The final verse of the prophecy has not yet been sung." Thalion clenched his fists. "Then tell me, what does it say?" Caladrius hesitated. "That is the question that must not be answered." Thalion stiffened. "What?" Caladrius sighed. "Fate is not a single road. It is 1,000 possibilities, all flowing toward one great moment. The prophecy was never meant to be a warning of the end. It is a test, a moment where the hands of fate can be seized or surrendered. His gaze darkened. And you, Thalion, are the one who must decide the true fate of Ulthuan. Thalion swallowed hard, his heartbeat thundering in his chest. Tell me what to do. Caladrius gave a sad smile. I cannot. I am merely a shadow now, caught in the battle between what was and what will be. His form flickered, growing weaker. The monstrous force beyond them stirred, sensing the intrusion. The enemy is coming, Caladrius whispered. I cannot hold it back forever. But you still have a choice. He lifted a hand, and a final spark of light flickered in the void. A fragment of the Starheart, the last remnant of its shattered power, pulsing faintly with the echoes of lost prophecy. If you take this, Caladrius said, you will carry the final verse within you. It will lead you to the moment where fate will be decided. Thalion hesitated. And if I refuse? Caladrius's expression darkened. Then Ulthuan will fall. A long silence stretched between them. Then, with unshaking hands, Thalion reached out and grasped the final fragment of fate, the last choice. The moment his fingers closed around the Starheart fragment, the void collapsed. The great monstrous force roared, tendrils of dark fate unraveling as the gate of eternity tore itself apart. Thalion felt himself ripped backward, the stars vanishing, the prophecy shattering around him. And then he was back. The ruined temple of Aetine stood around him once more. Calith and his warriors were rushing toward him, shouting his name, their weapons drawn. Because the invaders had come. The battle for Ulthuan had begun. And Thalion, with the final fragment of prophecy burning in his hand, had to make the last choice. Chapter 28. The Last Battle Begins. The March of the Lost. The ocean boiled as the invaders came. From the depths of the great ocean, the lost elves emerged. Elves not of Ulthuan nor Nagaroth, but of something older, something forgotten. They came in gilded warships, their hulls forged from materials unknown, their sails shimmering with arcane symbols that defied the very laws of magic. And behind them, the true horror followed. Colossal war machines, taller than the highest towers of Lothern, moved across the waves, carried by forces unseen. They were not Drakai constructs, nor arcane war engines of the White Tower. They were relics of the old ones, remnants of a civilization that had disappeared before history itself was written, and they had come to claim what was theirs. Ulthuan trembled beneath their approach, the last stand of the Phoenix throne. The armies of the Asur gathered at the gates of Lothern, the jewel of Ulthuan, the seat of the Phoenix throne. From every kingdom they had come. The dragon knights of Calador, the swift riders of Illyrion, the mages of Sapphire, and the noble warriors of Yvres and Tiranoc. Their banners snapped in the wind. Their swords gleamed beneath the light of the rising sun. At their head the Phoenix King himself stood, clad in his golden warplate, the crown of Ulthuan resting heavy upon his brow. He did not speak, for there was nothing left to say. This was to be the final stand of the Asur, and the fate of Ulthuan would be decided here. The return of the Starborn. The first siege engines fired. Lothern's great walls trembled beneath the impact of weapons that should not exist, beams of pure energy, artifacts of a forgotten age, capable of ripping apart the fabric of the world itself. Panic spread among the defenders as the gates cracked, as the first ranks of the lost elves advanced, perfect in formation, moving like a tide of inevitability. And then, just as all seemed lost, the sky split open, A pillar of silver light erupted from the eastern cliffs, cutting through the chaos like the blade of a god. And from that light, Thalion Brightspear returned. The Starheart burned in his grasp, no longer a shattered relic, but whole once more, a conduit of fate itself, reforged in the fires of prophecy. The wind howled as he descended to the battlefield, his eyes blazing with the last remnants of Caladrius's knowledge. The Phoenix King turned, his expression stunned. "Thalion?" Thalion did not answer. Instead, he raised the Starheart, and for the first time, the lost elves halted. They could feel it, the weight of the final verse, the power of the Song of the Stars, a melody unfinished. And then, as the battle began in full, the sky darkened once more. The celestial alignment shifted, not toward the prophecy that had foretold Ulthuan's doom, but toward something else entirely. Talion's breath hitched. The prophecy had never been set in stone. It had always been a choice. And now, as the fate of Ulthuan hung by a thread, he realized, this war was not about who ruled Ulthuan. It was about who would rewrite its destiny. The last battle had begun, and the Song of the Stars was about to be sung in full. Chapter 29. The Song of the Stars Unleashed. The battle for Ulthuan. The streets of Lothern burned. Across the great walls of the Phoenix Court, the forces of the Lost Elves surged forward, their warriors relentless, their war machines unstoppable. The great defensive wards of the city flickered and failed, overrun by magic older than time itself. The defenders of Ulthuan fought with desperate fury, the knights of Calador riding their dragons through the sky, the mages of Safari weaving arcane barriers, the elven legions standing against the tide. But it was not enough. The prophecy was reaching its final verse, and Thalion Brightspear knew what had to be done. The ascent of the spire. Through the ruined streets Thalion ran, the Starheart pulsing in his grasp. It had guided him here, to this final moment, the last note of a song that had begun before the first Phoenix King had ever sat upon his throne. The highest spire of Lothern rose before him, its ivory steps slick with blood and rain. He forced himself onward, his breath ragged, his body screaming in pain. Behind him, Calith Shadow Dancer and his warriors fought to buy him time, cutting down the enemies that sought to stop him from reaching the peak. Thalion did not look back, because there was no turning back. The prophecy would end today, one way or another, the unleashing of fate. At the top of the spire, the winds howled, carrying the dying cries of Ulthuan into the sky. Thalion raised the Starheart, his grip tight around the celestial artifact. He could feel its power, unimaginable, infinite, a force that could rewrite the stars themselves. The final verse of the prophecy was waiting to be sung, and only he could unleash it. Thalion's voice was steady, despite the storm raging around him. "Hear me, heavens. Your song has been stolen, your truth rewritten by those who sought to bind fate itself." No longer. The Starheart ignited. A pillar of pure light erupted from the spire, splitting the storm above Lothern. The skies tore apart, as if reality itself was being rewritten. The constellations above Ulthuan shifted, their patterns breaking, realigning into something new, something unseen in any age of the world. And in that moment, the Lost Elves faltered. For the first time since they had risen from the depths, their warriors hesitated, their war machines slowed, as if they could feel the shifting weave of destiny itself. They had come believing that fate was theirs to command, that their return had been foretold, inevitable. But the stars no longer sang their victory. They sang of rebirth, and they did not sing for them. The price of ascension. Thalion's body shook, his soul unraveling. He had known this would be the price. The Starheart was not meant to be wielded by mortals. It was a fragment of the heavens themselves, a force beyond the grasp of gods and kings alike, and now it was consuming him. His fingers began to dissolve, turning to stardust, drifting upward into the sky. Yet there was no fear in his heart, only peace. He had seen Caladrius's sacrifice, and now he understood. Some things were meant to be lost so that the world could be made anew. Thalion exhaled one last time, looking toward the heavens, and there, far beyond the reach of time, he heard it, the song of the stars, not as a dirge of destruction, but as a melody of renewal. The final verse had been sung, and Ulthuan would endure. As the light of the Starheart exploded outward, Thalion's form dissolved into the stars. A warrior's body, lost. A hero's name, eternal. And far above, in the sky reborn, a new constellation burned. Chapter 30. The Song of the Stars. Awakening in the Void. There was no pain, no body, no breath, only consciousness, drifting like a mote of dust among the endless stars. Caladrius awoke in the void, not as flesh, not as the mage he once was, but as something else. Something more. The last thing he remembered was Tor Anlek, the Starheart burning in his grasp, the world falling apart beneath the weight of his final spell. He had died, and yet he was still here. The void stretched infinitely, neither dark nor light, neither cold nor warm. And in that void, the stars spoke. The truth beyond fate. The song of the stars whispered through the emptiness, its melody not of doom, but of continuance. He had thought the prophecy had been fulfilled, that the final verse had been sung. But he had been wrong. The stars still shifted. The constellations realigned, forming new paths, weaving new destinies. The prophecy had not ended. It had only been rewritten, and something was still coming. Something that had waited beyond time, watching, waiting for this exact moment. The battle for Ulthuan had not been the end. It had only been the beginning. A distant war yet to come. Caladrius drifted, the echoes of fate pulling at his mind. He saw Thalion's sacrifice, his body dissolving into the stars, his name written across the heavens. He saw the lost elves retreating, their empire shattered but not destroyed. And he saw something else. Beyond Ulthuan. Beyond the world itself. A force that had never been named, never been known. A will older than gods. A shadow in the stars. And he understood. Ulthuan had been spared, but it had not been saved. The true war had yet to begin. The final song of the stars had not yet been sung, and Caladrius Starborn, lost to the void, would be the first to hear its call. The stars still sing. Far across the cosmos, in a place beyond mortal reach, a single star flared to life, burning with the knowledge of what was to come. Caladrius turned toward it, his essence drawn forward, his path set before him. The story of Ulthuan was not finished, because the stars still sang, and now he would listen. The end was yet to come.